When you hear this sound, it's time to turn the page.
Hi, and welcome to Flipping Through. Today, we're reading things. Interesting things. Things by Saul Alinsky. Things by the name of Rules for Radicals. And we're going to critique it. On top here, we've got Jose.
Hi everybody, I'm Jose. I'm going to be doing the flipping again.
We've got me. Hi, I'm Al. I do things. Next, we have David.
Hello, I'm David Aragon. I animate and make comics. You can find all the things under this description.
Excellent. And then Gartham.
Hello, I will be your reader for today, and I'm a guy who enjoys philosophy and thinking about important things.
Amazil. How you do?
I'm alright, and hello, I am Lieutenant Amzil. I am also the host for another video series similar to this one called Let's Read. If you want to go check them out, they'll be over there in my channel, LT Amazil.
And next we have the man, the sage, the legend, Stanton.
Hello, I'm Stanton. I'm a IRL badass and internet amateur.
Mm-hmm. This is episode 3. We're going to be going over chapter 2 of Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, and I hope that you enjoy.
Alrighty then, we'll get started. Of means and ends. We cannot think first and act afterwards. From the moment of birth, we are immersed in action and can only fitfully guide it by taking thought. Alfred North Whitehead. I have heard the name Whitehead before. I have heard it mentioned, but it loses me who he is. I don't know if he is someone who does political science or if he's a philosophy or a psychologist. The name just sounds familiar.
It does sound familiar.
He was a British mathematician and philosopher, best known for his work in math logic and the philosophy of science.
That quote makes a lot of sense with regards to Whitehead, if that's his description. Because that quote in and of itself is very British. It's basically only in the sense that we are immersed in action, because big thing with British philosophy is they're big with knowing things through experience. And subscribing to, what's it called? Positivism.
Positivism? I've never heard of that one.
Positivism is basically, I believe it's the philosophy that the only things that we can know are things that can be learned through science.
I thought that was scientism.
Is it like
No, it's not scientism. Wait.
What'd you say, Jose?
I asked if it's anything similar to empiricism.
Man, this is okay. I could go down a whole rabbit hole of this, but basically, empiricism is basically the tradition of knowing things through our senses. However, our senses and experience are technically a little bit different, and how those are defined.
So positivism is to know via experiences, and empiricism is to know via senses.
Existentialism.
Okay. All right, damn. This is the episode where Garth explains everything. No, but so basically, positivism is specifically the stance that that we can only know things by using science. Knowing things by experience can involve a bunch of different things that is not only subject to the senses, but empiricism specifically has to do with being able to know things by using our senses.
And the balance must be struck between the two.
My only question for that, Garth, is what is the definition of know? Because it seems like it could be a subjective definition. Are you talking about know beyond any other option, or are you knowing, where is the line of know to each idea?
I mean, if you're going to argue about the definition of what does it mean to know something, you're asking the fundamental question of epistemology.
Well, I it's not the fundamental question, but each idea, saying you know through science, is that kind of it's the only way to really know? with a 99.9% accuracy, or is it your personal experience that gives you that 99.9% accuracy?
Science fits into that category of experience. You need to first you need to believe that science is possible and true first, and that's part of experience, but it fits within there. It doesn't stand on its own and have like some freaking empirical status. It fits within the human experience.
So it's not just like this is how you believe or this is how you believe. It's how you believe about certain things.
Yeah, it really. Well, yeah, because because one of the questions about science is that, well, yeah, science is a process of trying to understand something very specific. The only question is, what are you trying to know by using science? Because the thing is that mathematics is not scientific, but there are plenty of things that we can know using mathematics.
Well, didn't there need to be at least some form of minor if you're going into like what scientia as Bill Craig calls it or whatever, isn't there an element where you also need to use science to prove mathematics is true?
No,
It
because
needs to be tested over and over again, and then you can believe that it's true.
So, well, here's the thing. Well, there's many different ways to test something. Science is simply one of them. The thing is that mathematics, like the whole history of mathematics in and of itself mathematics is more of a rational process, I guess, is the best way to describe it. It doesn't just it is so freaking complicated. All I could say to give it like a stark contrast to knowing something by experience would be knowing something rationally. And that was a big contention, I believe, with, British and German philosophy, is knowing something through, using the mind versus knowing something via experience.
Okay. So back to the original quote. We cannot think first and act afterwards. I'm not sure what that means. Of course we can think first and act afterwards.
Does he believe that people don't have free will? Like, what's going on here?
So I think this is he's basically just trying to make an observation. He's saying that, by nature, we can't help but do something when we are born. And then we do something, and then afterwards we take thought in the things that we do.
Okay.
I think that's what he's trying to say.
All right.
So
it just doesn't seem to be a true statement. I mean, it is in one sense, but I don't think it's covering the entire, territory properly. We think first and act afterwards. Well,
no,
we cannot think. We also think and then act. We think I'm going to do this today. I'm going to schedule myself this way. We do that. So just because the statement that he says happens to be true, it's still not the full picture.
If we couldn't think first and act afterwards, we could never assemble anything.
Exactly.
So there has to be that. So I'm just trying to see what he is trying to say with this, and it doesn't really mean much to me.
Yeah, well, meanwhile, I'm trying to find everything that's wrong with it and want to have an enemy, and I can just put my dukes up and not like this person.
If only life was that easy.
If only. I know.
But it could be something think about walking, the mere act of walking, right? Do we think about walking when we walk?
When you have knee pain,
Think about
walking.
Yeah.
No, not really. It's kind of like a Haitian elephant rider deal.
I think that's kind of what he's going for. He's saying that kind of we as people, we just kind of tend to our base mode of being would be that we tend to act, and then afterwards we cognitively think about it. Then afterwards,
Okay. Fair enough.
I,
Fair enough.
As far as how true the quote is, I don't know if I could take that as an absolute.
Shall we continue?
Yep, we'll continue. All right. That perennial question, does the end justify the means, is meaningless as it stands. The real and only question regarding the ethics of means and ends is, and always has been, does this particular end justify this particular means? Life and how you live it is the story of means and ends. The end is what you want, and the means is how you get it. Whenever we think about social change, the question of means and ends arises. The man of action views the issue of means and ends in pragmatic and strategic terms. He has no other problem. He thinks only of his actual resources and the possibilities of various choices of action. He asks of ends only whether they are achievable and worth the cost, of means only whether they will work. To say that corrupt means corrupt the ends is to believe in the immaculate conception of ends and principles. The real arena is corrupt and bloody. Life is a corrupting process from the time a child learns to play his mother off against his father in the politics of when to go to bed. He who fears corruption fears life. The practical revolutionary will understand Goethe's conscience is the virtue of observers and not of agents of action. In action, one does not always enjoy the luxury of a decision that is consistent both with one's individual conscience and the good of mankind. The choice must always be for the latter. Action is for mass salvation and not for the individual's personal salvation. He who sacrifices the mass good for his personal conscience has a peculiar conception of personal salvation. He doesn't care enough for people to be corrupted for them. The men who pile up the heaps of discussion and literature on the ethics of means and ends, which with rare exception is conspicuous for its sterility, rarely write about their own experiences in the perpetual struggle of life and change. They are strangers, moreover, to the burdens and problems of operational responsibility and the unceasing pressure for immediate decisions. They are passionately committed to a mystical objectivity where passions are suspect. They assume a non-existent situation where men dispassionately, and with reason, draw and devise means and ends as if studying a navigational chart on land. They can be recognized by one of two proverbial brands. We agree with the ends, but not the means, or this is not the time. The means and end moralist, or non-doers, always wind up on their ends without any means. The means and ends moralists, constantly obsessed with the ethics of the means used by the have-nots against the haves, should search themselves as to their real political position. In fact, they are passive, but real, allies of the haves. They are ones Jacques Maritain referred to in his statement, "The fear of soiling ourselves by entering the context of history is not virtue, but a way of escaping virtue." These non-doers were the ones who chose not to fight the Nazis in the only way they could have been fought. They were the ones who drew their window blinds to shut out the shameful spectacle of Jews and political prisoners being dragged through the streets. They were the ones who privately deplored the horror of it all and did nothing. This is the nadir of immorality. The most unethical of all means is the non-use of any means. It is this species of man who so vehemently and militantly participated in that classically idealistic debate at the old League of Nations on the ethical differences between defensive and offensive weapons. Their fears of action drive them to refuge in an ethics so divorced from the politics of life that it can apply only to angels, not to men. The standards of judgment must be rooted in the whys and wherefores of life as it is lived. The world as it is, not our wish for fantasy of the world as it should be.
Damn, so there's a lot right there, I think.
Yeah, this chapter is incredibly dense. I can start the conversation with my first thought. So when he says the statement, does this particular end justify this particular means? So to go to the first one, does the end justify the means? Which I believe is a quote from a ancient pre-Socratic philosopher. But then he goes and says, does this particular end justify this particular means, giving ethics a context of action I feel like that does this particular end justify this particular means is just the basic question of ethics. Only thing it's being applied to in the situation is what do we do?
Yes, the part where it goes on to the means and ends moralists that are constantly obsessed with the ethics of the means should search to as their real political position, because they are passive and they will end up without any means. It's kind of a dangerous idea that there's always going to be some ends that are justified any means, because it's really kind of it's about timing and not so much about tactic.
Basically, it's the way that he sets up his ethics in this book is that it basically forces people to act one way or another, because to not act about anything would be unethical.
Yes.
Which I don't know, because because I could think of situations where if I did not know if something was ethical or not, is it then ethical to take one side or the other if you really don't know?
Yeah, exactly. I think forcing yourself to act is not very wise, especially if you're caught between a rock and a hard place.
And the thing is that Saul Alinsky is an incredibly smart guy, because the ethics of ends and means always is, does this particular end justify this particular means? And I would agree with that, because people do that in most of the time in very, very casual ways.
I think that is right. You do have the right intuition there.
Another thing, right at the beginning, to say that corrupt means corrupt the ends is to believe in the immaculate conception of ends and principles. The real arena is corrupt and bloody. So it's actually rationalizing the use of corruption to bring about positive ends. And if you enter the fray with that in your mind, you are really opening up a lot of immoral activity, because you can really rationalize corruption and bloodshed through the ideal of reaching an end that could probably not see that type of corruption out. So I can say there may be sometimes that you could possibly say corruption is a good thing, but it's going to be a really, really hard sell for me.
Well, something I was thinking about this is that because there's two different ways that a person can rationalize something. They could do a justification where it's, oh, well, you do something and then you provide your rationalization for doing things. Or you have some sort of principle where one may treat you the same way that I would want to be treated, and therefore you use that to rationalize on how you would act. Because, to me, justification, I think this is kind of what you're trying to get at, is that justification is kind of rationalization going backwards to find a principle. But that backwards principle tends to be corruption. So it's a justification. It's very utilitarian. I guess utilitarian in a negative sense.
Yeah, I was about to say.
And for all of the things he's talking about, corruption, life is a corrupting process, and those who fear corruption fear life. It's really making it like this is part of existence, and if you don't use it, you will be abused by it.
That does sound pretty fair and accurate.
In a sense, it's right.
Which does not bode well for society.
Mm-hmm.
Not at all, but yeah.
I mean, it's just crazy to me that you could think, yes, if I build a society off of corruption, in the end, it won't be a society built off of corruption. I mean, isn't that kind of what the whole problem with slavery is right now in the United States? Is it built off the back of slaves, and therefore it built off the back of corruption and evil and immoral activity. So if you start a new system based off of corruption and immorality, you're going to lead into the exact same things. So maybe it's not the best route, even though it made it possible. It sounds like something that at best will come back to bite you in the ass.
What the book definitely seems like it's trying to do is lay down a lot of harsh truths about the world in order to convince the reader. And the thing is, like, sometimes he's right.
Yeah.
Because it's like the basic notion of rhetoric. It's convincing someone through reason and appealing to their feelings. Now, obviously, a normal person would say, well, that's terrible. You would want to convince someone using pure reason. But then you have to ask yourself, like, when are we truly being reasonable? Like, aren't we always just using rhetoric? And so a lot of this boils down to is, what are the harsh truths of the world and of history? And based on that, how do we, I guess, act forward? Is the main question that the book is trying to answer.
Truly a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I did want to say something else, that just to give the viewers a big context, what was it? In the paragraph, he says, they assume a non-existent situation where men dispassionately and with reason draw and devise means and ends as of studying a navigational chart on land. And so basically, he's basically kind of making fun of the people who try to be as logical and reasonable about it. This book definitely operates under perspectives rather than making a lot of logical arguments. And you'll see that consistently as we read through the book. But anyway, we will, we'll continue. Actually, the way this book is organized from here on out is he lays down a bunch of rules. So how we'll go through it is we'll go by each rule at a time, with exception to the first two, because they're very similar. So that way we can keep it. Makes my job a lot easier.
Alrighty.
12 rules
So that's
for
why you're doing it.
radicals.
Yep. All right. So here we go. I present here a series of rules pertaining to the ethics of means and ends. First, that one's concern with the ethics of means and ends varies inversely with one's personal interest in the issue. When we are not directly concerned, our morality overflows. As La Rochefoucauld put it, we all have strength enough to endure the misfortunes of others. Accompanying this rule is the parallel one that one's concern with the ethics of means and ends varies inversely with one's distance from the scene of conflict. The second rule of the ethics of means and ends is that the judgment of the ethics of means and ends is dependent upon the political position of those sitting in judgment. If you actively oppose the Nazi occupation and joined the underground resistance, then you adopted the means of assassination, terror, property destruction, the bombing of tunnels and trains, kidnapping, and the willingness to sacrifice innocent hostages to the end of defeating the Nazis. Those who opposed the Nazi conquerors regarded the resistance as a secret army of selfless patriotic idealists, courageous beyond expectation, and willing to sacrifice their lives to their moral convictions. To the occupation authorities, however, these people were lawless, terrorists, murderers, saboteurs, assassins who believed that the end justified the means and were utterly unethical according to the mystical rules of war. Any foreign occupation would so ethically judge its opposition. However, in such conflict, neither protagonist is concerned with any value except victory. It is life or death. To us, the Declaration of Independence is a glorious document and an affirmation of human rights. To the British, on the other hand, it was a statement notorious for its deceit by omission. In the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Particulars attesting to the reasons for the revolution cited all of the injustices which the colonists felt that England had been guilty of, but listed none of the benefits. There was no mention of the food the colonies had received from the British Empire during times of famine, medicine during times of disease, soldiers during times of war with the Indians and other foes, or the many other direct and indirect aids to the survival of the colonies. Neither was there notice of the growing number of allies and friends of the colonists in the British House of Commons, and the hope for imminent remedial legislation to correct the inequities under which the colonies suffered. Jefferson, Franklin, and others were honorable men, but they knew that the Declaration of Independence was a call to war. They also knew that a list of many of the constructive benefits of the British Empire to the colonists would have so diluted the urgency of the call to arms for the revolution as to have been self-defeating. The result might well have been a document attesting to the fact that justice weighed down the scale at least 60% on our side and only 40% on their side, and that because of that 20% difference, we were going to have a revolution. To expect a man to leave his wife, his children, and his home, to leave his crops standing in the field, and pick up a gun and join the Revolutionary Army for a 20% difference in the balance of human justice was to defy common sense. The Declaration of Independence, as a declaration of war, had to be what it was, a 10% statement of the justice of the cause of the colonists and a 100% denunciation of the role of the British government as evil and unjust. Our cause had to be all shining justice allied with the angels. Theirs had to be all evil tied to the devil. In no war has the enemy or the cause ever been gray. Therefore, from one point of view, the omission was justified. From the other, it was deliberate deceit. History is made up of moral judgments based on politics. We condemned Lenin's acceptance of money from the Germans in 1917, but were discreetly silent while our Colonel William B. Thompson, in the same year, contributed $1 million to the anti-Bolsheviks in Russia. As allies of the Soviets in World War II, we praised and cheered communist guerrilla tactics when the Russians used them against the Nazis during the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. We denounced the same tactics when they are used by communist forces in different parts of the world against us. The opposition's means used against us are always immoral, and our means are always ethical and rooted in the highest of human values. George Bernard Shaw, in Man and Superman, pointed out the variations in ethical definitions by virtue of where you stand. Mendoza said to Tanner, "I am a brigand. I live by robbing the rich." Tanner replied, "I am a gentleman. I live by robbing the poor. Shake hands."
I just want to say something really quickly. I thought he was doing a good job of like covering his bases, because my first critique was going to be that all of his examples that he was citing were all like from World War II against the Nazis, and honestly, like, who the fuck is going to defend an example like that's involving Nazis? Like, you're always obviously going to drop on one side of that issue. Of course, the French resistance was noble and whatever, but I do have to give it to him when he started to talk about the American Revolution.
But here's and here's the thing. This is what I was saying, that Saul Alinsky is operating under perspectives, right? Mm-hmm. Like, the whole argument that he just made was basically one from a difference of perspective. The only thing that I have to criticize him about this whole section is that, so he said something that, nothing back then was ever, like, gray, which I don't agree with. Like, I don't think the Americans all the way back then saw this as a black and white issue. Now, he could be saying that when you're an activist and you are opposing someone, that the tactics that you have to use has to be 100% good us, 100% bad them.
Yeah.
Excellent point. It definitely is. It's almost like it kind of pokes nuance a little bit, but it's like, nah, don't pay attention to that. Oh, but it's here. But don't pay attention to that.
I mean, if in order for you to be a radical and do radical actions, that is kind of the position that you have to, that is the viewpoint that you have to adopt in order to be effective or be a good radical activist. You can't
to avoid demoralization.
Yeah, but also, like, you wouldn't be seen as a good activist if you were if you sympathized a little for the people that you opposed. Because, you can't, like, we've seen it before, not to bring current issues into the world, but
go for it.
But if you're an Antifa, but you also support like the police or have a Blue Lives Matter, and you understand that there's more nuance than it being a systematic issue, then you're not going to be taken at that. Then the people in that in-group and the people that you are fighting for are not going to see you as much of a radical activist, or as good of a radical activist as if you were to just be purely black and white.
I mean, that's how the presidential race is being run right now.
Yes, it is, and it's terrifying.
But what a lot of this boils down to is, well, which perspective is more justified than the other? And also, I don't even know if these rules, what does he call them? The rule of ethics of means and ends. I don't even know if this stuff falls under the realm of, well, it kind of falls under the realm of ethics. But I would prefer tactics.
Thank you. I kept trying to read this chapter over and over again. Every time I kept getting flared up because it kept pushing something that claimed that it was ethics, and yet it was actually tactics.
Yeah, and that's something that it does continuing on. And I think that's something where was it? One's concern with the ethics of means and ends varies inversely with one's distance from the scene of conflict.
Yes, I was just about to bring that up.
What?
I disagree with the first rule for a couple of reasons here. One's concern with the ethics of tactics varies inversely with their personal interest in the issue. See, that really depends upon the tactics, because if the tactic is burning down half of the country, then one's personal interest becomes massive. Without interest in the issue that the person is burning half the country down for. It's not inversely, it's completely relative to the ethics, because the worse it gets, the more people without interest in the issue will take interest. The second half, the concern with the ethics, is related to one's distance from the scene of conflict, is only really in kind of, I feel it may be outdated in the information age, because we have live stream videos of scenes of conflict coming to us live, and we can see exactly the tactics and the ethics of the tactics being used. So it really has less to do with the distance to the scene of the conflict than it used to. Although, like I said with the first one, if the conflict comes to your doorstep, you are forced to take interest in the issue.
I was reading the sentence afterwards when he says, when we are not directly concerned, our morality overflows. Which I think is basically a statement that people will virtue signaling.
Yeah,
the more. Anyway, you understand what I mean.
Well, I do. I don't know if everybody else does, but I definitely get where you're coming from.
Yeah, I'm on the same page.
He uses that La Rochefoucauld quote, who's old. La Rochefoucauld, for everyone, is an old French philosopher.
Fuck
basically.
Foucault.
But, well, yeah, he was fine. He basically invented the aphorism. But anyway, he says we all have strength enough to endure the misfortunes of others. Basically, what that quote in general is saying is that the misfortune of others can easily be burdened upon other people, but the burden upon the self is a lot more heavier type thing. And I think that's kind of basically what he's going for, which is why he makes that statement where interest and concern tend to inverse each other. Because you technically could be really interested in something that you're not concerned about, but if there's something that you are concerned about,
very, very concerned about,
then the interest starts to decline. That you want, in the sense that you're not interested in it, but you're concerned. So all you're worried about is you're just worried about doing something.
Yeah, that the other way.
That becomes another ends justifying the means kind of sub-universe under there. Like, you feel like you need to do something. Okay, what is the actual thing that you're willing to do? Is it, I don't know, just chanting and getting everybody to agree with you? and also almost to an authoritarian level, like those freaking Antifa people going to the restaurant and being like, "No, you need to raise your fist or else you're against us." Like that is doing something. It really is doing something. And I bet you they believe that they're really in the right doing it.
It's creating Trump supporters.
Exactly. Like, do the ends justify the means? And how far of a perspective are you willing to look at those ends and those means?
Well, yeah, to use Saul Alinsky's phrase, does this particular end justify this particular means?
That's right.
God damn it. I can't believe I'm agreeing with him.
Well, I don't like that quote. Does this particular end justify the particular means? Because then that means you're operating by justification, which is not a healthy way to live.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
So, for instance, like in an ideal world, is that you have ideals, right? And then you therefore would, I mean, there's many different ways to do it. Is that you then act upon the world upon those principles, right?
Yeah.
And then the inverse would be basically acting upon the world and then coming up with the rationalization for that action.
Like post hoc.
Yeah, kind of, a little bit. It would be like principles, and then upon those principles acting, whereas you're acting, and then through action you, I guess, discover principles.
Okay.
I don't know. That's just my thought.
All right, fair enough.
I'm more of a principle, and then you would act upon those principles from my own ethical standpoint.
Wouldn't that be the same as justifying it in post?
So for the terminology that I'm using, I wouldn't say it's a justification, because it's like, all right, I should treat you the way that I would want to treat others, correct? Like that would be a principle that both you and I would agree on. Therefore, what we should do, that if since I don't like being punched, therefore you shouldn't punch me, kind of thing. Whereas the opposite, where two people punch each other, and then they go, well, you punched me. Well, why did you punch me? And then they would come up with some type of justification for it, basically.
Yeah.
Ah, I see what you mean now. And with it being done after the fact.
Yeah, kind of. It's principle and then action versus action and then principle.
What I'm having a problem with within this chapter, within this page specifically, is Saul keeps doing this like good guy, bad guy thing. And it's almost, what's he say here? In fact, they are passive but real allies of the haves. So the haves are immediately the enemy. That's a problem. Somebody who is competent and really, really damn good at what they do is a have. He's just assuming that the haves have gotten there from corrupt means. They steal it from other people. No, some of these people are actually fucking competent. The Joe Rogan podcast is really successful because Joe Rogan does a goddamn good job.
No, bro. Michael Jordan stole his talent from somebody else.
Duh.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. It's
Mike
so
Tyson
narrow-minded.
Mike Tyson stole his fucking fury by waking up every day at 4 a.m. to go for a 5-mile run. That's stealing from other people, didn't you know? Fucking filthy halves.
God damn it.
Yeah, fucking Muhammad Ali
Alright.
fighting in the jungle. He stole it from the white men.
So, what do you figure is benefit of the doubt? When Alinsky says the haves, he really means the corrupted haves? Or does he actually mean just those with more power?
I think he... Again, this book is about perspective.
It certainly
So
is.
it wouldn't matter if the haves were truly one way or the other, or if the have-nots were truly one way or the other. In the book, it all depends on how they're perceived.
Yeah, as victims and criminals. We're seeing that trickle down right now. And that's destroying society. With thunderous applause by the media, by the way. But I'm going to shut the fuck up.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right, we'll continue then. The third rule of the ethics of means and ends is that in war the end justifies almost any means. Agreements on the Geneva Rules on treatment of prisoners or use of nuclear weapons are observed only because the enemy or his potential allies may retaliate. Winston Churchill's remarks to his private secretary a few hours before the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union graphically pointed out the politics of means and ends in war. Informed of the imminent turn of events, the secretary inquired how Churchill, the leading British anti-communist, would reconcile himself to being on the same side as the Soviets. Would not Churchill find it embarrassing and difficult to ask his government to support the communists? Churchill's reply was clear and unequivocal. Not at all. I have only one purpose, the destruction of Hitler, and my life is much simplified thereby. If Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. In the Civil War, President Lincoln did not hesitate to suspend the right of habeas corpus and to ignore the directive of the Chief Justice of the United States. Again, when Lincoln was convinced that the use of military commissions to try civilians was necessary, he brushed aside the illegality of this action with the statement that it was indispensable to the public's safety. He believed that the civil courts were powerless to cope with the insurrectionist activities of civilians. Must I shoot a simple-minded soldier boy who deserts, while I must not touch a hair of a wily agitator who induces him to desert?
Yes. Yes, you should not. Yes. I mean, okay, I just want to say something about, like, this whole mentality of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? I don't think that's true at all. Because, again, to bring it back to current events, when the supposed death squads that Trump supposedly said to send to Antifa started to arrest people on the streets, the leftists started saying, oh no, where's all the libertarians standing up for people being snatched up by the government? Well, here's the thing, that you have avowed that libertarians are all deplorable people. You have said libertarians are all Nazis. We do not like the police as libertarians, but what, are we supposed to save you from the police when you previously have said that you want to destroy and punch us because you think we're Nazis? Like, if one side is decisively against us, the other side is passively against our principles. I think that the decision to step away from that situation is pretty clear. I'm not going to run into the middle of a shooting between the Bloods and the Crips and grab a gun and start shooting the Bloods or something. Like, I'm not doing that. That's not me, and that's not my problem. So why should I step in?
And especially in the perspective of them looking towards the libertarians for help, it's like, even if you did support them and said that, yeah, this is wrong, would they even care? Would that change anything? Would that change their perspective or anything like that?
You mean if the libertarians actually did step up to help, would the anarchists then friend it? No, it wouldn't, because on
still view them as Nazis and stuff.
Exactly, because they're right wing and they're far from the Overton window as they see it. They would still think that libertarians are an existential threat to them.
And that's kind of the problem when viewing things in a black and white lens and denouncing the people who are the do-nothings. Because when you need the people who do nothings, but you denounce them for doing nothing, then what do you want them to do?
Ooh. Exactly. Ooh. I think you nailed it pretty well right there.
This is this is probably his weakest rule out of all of these, because it's not really saying much. It's only saying, well, in times of war, drastic times call for drastic measures.
And I think that is so wrong. I think Lincoln was wrong in suspending habeas corpus. Totally wrong.
I'm going to fall under that bus and say, yeah, I agree with you.
I mean, yes, here's the thing. The suspension of habeas corpus did not decide the outcome of that war. What decided the outcome of the Civil War was that the North was heavily industrialized and the South was reliant,
was more self-reliant, whereas the South had built more of a slave economy.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Thank you.
it's almost
Those
as
had
if
trains and everything like that. Like they had the industry. The South was still like archaic in the way it did industry. Like suspending habeas corpus probably did nothing for the war in terms of the outcome.
exacerbate it. But it, ugh. I think that's a really great example of like success. Like which one won? The one that used slavery or the one that focused on, like getting
Well,
Adam
listen, what
fronted
I'm
here.
saying is that
Why
if you suspend your principles for minute benefit, then in a worse situation, the opposing side can use that as propaganda against you.
No,
So why
absolutely.
would you abandon your principles if they are right? If you don't need that to win, why would you suspend it?
And more importantly, when we're talking about stuff like that, you never know. Like even if you do win, you don't know if that thing that you've like. If we want to stay in the let's stay in the World War II. Like with the nuke, like yeah, it did decisively end the war, but however, we still morally pay for that, and more than that, when you do questionable means to get to the end, you don't know if that will actually be the end that you desire,
Yeah,
and
this is
you'll have to
very
live with it.
exactly. This is a very how do you call it? Like a hindsight sort of situation.
Yeah, it's very short-sighted, I think.
But very quickly, what I did want to bring up about the Civil War in America is the side that had industrialization and focused more on individuality, despite its flaws, succeeded. One that was dependent on slavery did not work. And I don't know if you can glean any kind of sense of morality from that, as far as if you consider morality to be the most successful for the majority of people over a period of time. Yeah.
Well, let me say this. I'm not even making a moral argument here. Like I just rejecting his analogy. I think it's completely wrong. It doesn't apply at all because again, accusing Lincoln of being corrupt because he suspended habeas corpus, like yes, he was, but there was no justification because it was a mute point to the outcome of the war. The war would have ended the same way because that was not the deciding factor on the outcome of the war.
Gotcha.
Yeah, this is definitely his. I don't know. I would say that. I would just say that this is definitely his weakest point in the book because it really doesn't say much, to be honest, compared to the other points that he makes.
It would be like saying the French lost World War I because they wore red pants. Like, yeah, the Germans see the French better because they were wearing blue shirts and red pants, but that's not why France lost the war, dude.
Yeah.
And as well, I also wanted to say this actually, and I'm sorry for extending this. This Churchill quote right here also, again, is short-sighted because, yeah, you would, sure, like if the devil was against Hitler, you would side with the devil, and actually, you would give him a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. Okay, what about after Hitler?
Yeah,
Now the devil is in the House
you're
of
stuck with the devil.
Exactly. So like the enemy of your enemy, the enemy of your enemy is not your friend. I think is what I'm getting at. I think that's a very big misnomer we have going on.
The enemy of your enemy is convenient.
Yeah.
That is brilliant.
Or
a
it's
while.
an ally. Is an ally.
Well, the enemy of your enemy is not your friend for very long.
Again, I don't think suspending your principles, your founding principles, is a good idea in any situation.
Yeah.
And this whole like little song and dance he has about life is corruption or whatever, I think that is true like irrationally true, but it's not practical to go around saying to people.
Yeah.
It's not a good thing to like go to people, tell them to act a certain way because hey, like you're corrupt after all because human nature or whatever. Like, okay, yeah, my human nature is to fucking punch somebody in the face when they treat me wrongly, but I shouldn't act on that. That doesn't mean I have to succumb to that base instinct.
It's definitely a tilted lens of perspective. It's something. It's not the full freaking story, and to say, oh yeah, life is only this way, is kind of jacked up. Like there's a lot more nuance going on than that.
I agree with you. I think we should continue.
Yes.
Before we do, one thing that was interesting about Lincoln suspending habeas corpus was doing it under the guise of being for public safety. And public safety is something we hear a lot about in the age of COVID. So, so the rights being suspended for the reason of public safety is kind of a trigger for me, and I really don't trust it.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of how we got the Patriot Act as well.
Exactly.
Excellent point.
Now
Excellent
we
point.
don't have any privacy. I think that's a good point. We should continue.
Yes.
All right, sounds good. This next one's a long one, so sit tight. The fourth rule of the ethics of means and ends is that judgment must be made in the context of the times in which the action occurred and not from any other chronological vantage point. The Boston Massacre is a case in point. British atrocities alone, however, were not sufficient to convince the people that murder had been done on the night of March 5th. There was a deathbed confession of Patrick Carr that the townspeople had been the aggressors and that the soldiers had fired in self-defense. This unlooked-for recantation from one of the martyrs who was dying in the odor of sanctity with which Sam Adams had vested them sent a wave of alarm through the Patriot ranks. But Adams blasted Carr's testimony in the eyes of all pious New Englanders by pointing out that he was an Irish papist who had probably died in the confession of the Roman Catholic Church. After Sam Adams had finished with Patrick Carr, even Tories did not dare to quote him to prove Bostonians were responsible for the massacre. To the British, this was a false, rotten use of bigotry and an immoral means characteristic of the revolutionaries, or the Sons of Liberty. To the Sons of Liberty and to the Patriots, Sam Adams' action was brilliant strategy and a godsend lifesaver. Today, we may look back and regard Adams' action in the same light as the British did. But remember that we are not today involved in a revolution against the British Empire. Ethical standards must be elastic to stretch with the times. In politics, the ethics of means and ends can be understood by the rules suggested here. History is made up of little else but examples such as our position on freedom of the high seas in 1812 and 1917, contrasted with our 1962 blockade of Cuba or our alliance in 1942 with the Soviet Union against Germany, Japan, and Italy, and the reversal in alignments in less than a decade. Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, his defiance of a directive of the Chief Justice of the United States, and the illegal use of military commissions to try civilians were by the same men who had said in Springfield 15 years earlier, "Let me not be understood as saying that there are no bad laws, or that grievances may not arise for the redress of which no legal provisions have been made. I mean to say no such thing. But I do mean to say that although bad laws, if they exist, should be repealed, still, while they continue in force, for the sake of example, they should be religiously observed." This was also the same Lincoln who, a few years prior to his signing the Emancipation Proclamation, stated in his first inaugural address, "I do but quote from one of those speeches when I declare that I have no purpose directly or indirectly to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. Those who nominated and elected me did so with full knowledge that I made this and many similar declarations and have never recanted them. Those who would be critical of the ethics of Lincoln's reversal of positions have a strangely unreal picture of a static, unchanging world, where one remains firm and committed to certain so-called principles or positions. In the politics of human life, consistency is not a virtue. To be consistent means, according to the Oxford Universal Dictionary, standing still or not moving. Men must change with the times or die. The change in Jefferson's orientation when he became president is pertinent to this point. Jefferson had incessantly attacked President Washington for using national self-interest as the point of departure for all decisions. He castigated the president as narrow and selfish and argued that decisions should be made on a world interest basis to encourage the spread of the ideas of the American Revolution. that Washington's adherence to the criteria of national self-interest was a betrayal of the American Revolution. However, from the first moment when Jefferson assumed the presidency of the United States, his every decision was dictated by national self-interest. This story from another century has parallels in our century and every other.
This guy. It's almost as if Saul is trying to say, "Don't the fuck principles." That's exactly what it looks like to me. He's like, "Oh well, everybody else doesn't use principles. The times have changed. Nobody else is using principles. Therefore, you shouldn't use principles."
He seems...
Remember that he's being very. This is a very pragmatic type of book. Like he doesn't care about principles. Like he's telling you how to win, basically. This is how you win. You play dirty.
It's like Jordan Belfort book, but instead of getting rich off the back of, like, what do you call it? Stock options. Yeah, like fooling people to buy stocks. He's more like talking about overthrowing governments despite your side, right? It's not really taking sides, but it is kind of, like you said, telling you how to win, and sort of principles be damned, because people in the past haven't been very consistent. But I'd also want to stress that sometimes people change, and one of the things I like the most in storytelling is character arcs. So if Jefferson, and I don't know anything about that, you might notice by my accent I'm not American. But
yes, you are. You're Central American.
Whatever.
The point is, Jefferson might have sort of realized the error in his ways, even if he wasn't mistaken. Just maybe he realized that being nationalist was more important around that time in his position of power.
Well,
Maybe.
yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, especially when, given the time frame of Jefferson, you're in charge, or you have a big position of power over this very new country. You have to be nationalist, at least in a degree, in order to have the stability that you would want out of your country.
Yeah.
I'm so disappointed in Alinsky, because I think in the prologue he was basically saying, be the change you want to see. But now he's saying fuck principles and fuck the system, basically.
No, well, it's very hard, because it's how do you address the issue that humans are inconsistent and do inconsistent things?
Well, I think in the realm of politics, consistency has something different. Like it has a different definition, right? Like he said the exact dictionary definition of consistent: standing still or not moving. Well, what are we talking about? Are we talking about cinematics, or are we talking about the political process, right?
Wrong word. Hypocritical. Hypocritical would be the better word.
Yeah. And I don't like the way that he's brought up that definition, because it kind of goes back into the do-nothings. It's almost like it almost sounds like a slight, where he's saying that those who are so focused on staying morally consistent end up doing nothing.
I don't think he's saying that. I think he's saying, like, he brought that up just to point out that Jefferson was critical of Washington because Washington was very nationalistic, but Jefferson wanted the American Revolution, also the American ideas, to spread across the world. And honestly, I think he would be pretty satisfied right now, wherever he is, to see how American ideas are being diffused around the world. However, I think he was then. Alinsky criticized him because he was also nationalistic when he got into office.
Well, they're both pretty nationalistic. Just because one wanted the ideas to spread around the world, where the other one wanted to focus more on the home country. It's still they still are very pro-America. One thing that didn't really bug me, but one thing that stood out was this is very similar to history is written by the victors. So it's the idea that no matter what you do, when you win, you'll be able to write the history on it and paint it in the best possible light.
That's such a that's such a nihilistic view of things, though. Like, what if that's not just the only way that history happens?
But the thing about the thing about history is that history is dependent upon perspective. Like it just is, and that's and I think that's kind of the point of the phrase that it's won by the victors, whereas the victors are people who have their perspective out there the most. So because of that, you're going to learn history more through their perspective.
Yeah, and they're certainly trying to do that right now.
No, I 100% agree.
They're trying to. They. Who is the they?
Say who it is.
There's a certain prominent political group that is currently trying to change the way that history is viewed. They claim that it is more close to reality, and yet it really isn't. It's just the same political spin that they're saying everybody else does. And I think only when you can submit and say, yes, there is actual truth to history, not just the perspective that you look at it from, not just the dogma and the perspective that I think that's going to be the winning team. The one that says, yeah, we did make mistakes. Yes, this happened, instead of weaponizing history.
Well, it's when history, when learning about history gets confused with what current ethical standards should be.
Ooh, that's a good one too.
Because here's the thing, and wow, I may get flagged for this, but think of how races were studied in the past. Like, are they racist? Yeah, clearly, of course. But back then, you encounter some off-tribe somewhere, like, in another corner of the world, and you have this society that likes to study stuff. What are you going to do? You're going to study them, make theories about them, and so on and so forth.
And what kind of theories come out of that? Because I believe that the objective truth and something closer to core morality that all people share, despite race, is going to be reached by those studies. So long as they're actually scientific and not propaganda.
Well, not from a moral standpoint, but just from a perspective standpoint. Like, trying to understand history from the perspective of the people that lived within said history.
Yeah. And what I'm trying to say is, even though the science of the time seemed immoral, it did, because it existed and it was immoral, it led to something more moral, if that makes any sense.
Well, I would lump in other things, not just science, but a lot of other things, religion, philosophy, culture, list
right.
could go on and on. But you, that's why history is really, really hard, because you have to take all that into consideration if you're trying to give history a perspective.
One other thing, he says, in the politics of human life, consistency is not a virtue. The insertion of human life in that sentence makes me wonder exactly what he's referring to. Because it kind of seems like he's slipping in a different context here when he's talking about what is virtuous or not. But if we ignore that and think about just our modern view of what politics is, being consistent would be equated to being a conservative, and
that's a good point, man.
And if being consistent is something that is inherently negative, then it's kind of showing a bias here to a progressive mindset.
Oh, it absolutely is. Although when I hear the phrase, the politics of human life, I basically convert that to, what do you as a human being want? Because dependent on what you want will depend on what he calls politics of human life will be.
Yeah, see, and that's true, but when I see the politics, I see more the how to and not just the goals itself.
Huh.
Well, if he's talking about goals, if you don't have a consistent goal, then I don't know if I'm getting it right. Maybe I'm not paying attention.
So, Stanton, what you're saying is that you're not just saying the want, you're also saying the means.
Yes, because there's politics in means as well as goals, and because if you really break it down, well, let's say economically, everybody wants everyone to be successful. There is not any group out there that's being like, yeah, I just want to be successful. I want all those other people to not be successful. You know, maybe there are, but that's not a goal that is written on their manifesto. You know, it might be a accidental byproduct of their policies.
Well, now I'm going to be an asshole and do a Saul Alinsky. It's what particular person should be successful in what particular thing?
Something that they're competent with.
Well, I want to be a successful murderer, guys. That means you guys got to help me murder as much people as possible.
Bait and switch, you bastard.
Exactly. No, yeah, you're completely right. Like, I don't want certain people to be successful. Are you kidding me? Like, there's actually a lot of people and people that I know that I don't want them to be successful because I think they're either leading lives that are not conducive to their own personal well-being and also the well-being of others around them.
Yeah,
Exactly,
some people should not be allowed or put in positions of power. That's always been known.
Right. Well, I hesitate to give an example because it's kind of personal, but I don't want certain people to live destructive lifestyles that would affect their loved ones. I wish they would change. I wish their ambitions were different. Basically, that's all.
Yeah.
Oh man, this is almost going Greek at this point in time.
Yep, this is like philosophical questions at this point. The fifth rule of ethics of means and ends is that concern with ethics increases with the number of means available and vice versa. To the man of action, the first criterion in determining which means to employ is to assess what means are available. Reviewing and selecting available means is done on a straight utilitarian basis. Will it work? Moral questions may enter when one chooses among equally effective alternate means. But if one lacks the luxury of a choice and is possessed of only one means, then the ethical question will never arise. Automatically, the lone means becomes endowed with a moral spirit. Its defense lies in the cry, "What else could I do?" Inversely, the secure position in which one possesses the choice of a number of effective and powerful means is always accompanied by that ethical concern and serenity of conscience so admirably described by Mark Twain as the calm confidence of a Christian holding 4 aces. To me, ethics is doing what is best for the most. During a conflict with a major corporation, I was confronted with a threat of public exposure of a photograph of a motel, Mr. and Mrs. Registration, and photographs of my girl and myself. I said, go ahead and give it to the press. I think she's beautiful and I have never claimed to be celibate. Go ahead. That ended the threat. Almost on the heels of this encounter, one of the corporation's minor executives came to see me. It turned out that he was a secret sympathizer with our side. Pointing to his briefcase, he said, "In there is plenty of proof that so-and-so, a leader of the opposition, prefers boys to girls." I said, "Thanks, but forget it. I don't fight that way. I don't want to see it. Goodbye." He protested, "But they just tried to hang you on that girl." I replied, "The fact that they fight that way doesn't mean I have to do it. To me, dragging a person's private life into this muck is loathsome and nauseous." He left. So far, so noble. But if I had been convinced that the only way we could win was to use it, then without any reservations, I would have used it. What was my alternative? to draw myself into righteous moral indignation, saying, I would rather lose than corrupt my principles, and then go home with my ethical hymn intact. The fact that 40,000 poor would lose their war against hopelessness and despair was just too tragic. That their condition would even be worsened by the vindictiveness of the corporation was also terrible and unfortunate, but that's life. After all, one has to remember means and ends. It's true that I might have trouble getting to sleep because it takes time to tuck those big angelic moral rings under the covers. To me, that would be utter immorality.
Bruh.
Yeah. All right. So far, so noble.
I know.
World's biggest butt.
Oh, but little did he know that when he said boys, he meant little boys. Now, that
Bruh,
would've
if
been-
I had been convinced, like what?
Yeah.
If I had
All
been
I had to do.
convinced- Jesus
if the guy
Christ.
was a little more charismatic, I might have dragged him in.
No, dude, look, if I had been convinced that the only way we could win was to use it, then without any reservations, I would have used it. What if you're convinced but you're not right?
Yeah. What if it's fake on purpose?
What if it's
Yeah.
you're right? What if it's fake news and you push it for 2 years, leading the American people to think a stupid conspiracy theory that was not true?
Yeah, McCarthy.
What if you push rape accusations on somebody?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and you're convinced that they're true.
Yeah, and you repeat the lie so many times it becomes the truth. That's if that was your convinced that was your only way you could win, you'd have no reservations but to lie. You have no reservations but to be corrupt. This is the same problem as before, is rationalizing corruption, and this is ridiculous because every single rule kind of leads back to it's okay as long as you win.
Yes.
That's the only means to an end that matters is the means that make you win, because it doesn't, everything else is rationalized as long as you win.
Yeah. Yes.
It's
Well, I
a
think-
simple, no bad
we're getting-
tactics or.
we're getting. I mean, I think we got to be self-conscious because, again, this book is about winning. However, like, we did get outraged for a good reason because he's like saying that, oh, I'm so noble, like, here. I feel it just a bit hypocritical, but he then tries to get on front of that by saying, if I had been convinced, like, Jesus,
Well-
man, like,
My biggest problem so far has been, oh, don't worry about abandoning principles because that's the way to win. No. That's not the way that you win in the long term. That's not the way that you win hearts and minds. I do have a counterpoint to it. So, like, say Alinsky is trying to describe somebody like Edward Snowden right now. And I think that guy's a fucking hero.
right? I mean, yes.
You do need to abandon some principles, but I don't even think that the base moral principles were abandoned with Snowden. I think the loyalty principles were abandoned because the system that you're supposed to be loyal to was corrupt. Therefore, the contract is broken.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it.
The other counter to this is he's kind of making the trolley problem with more words. He's placing the reader at the switch and saying, look, you have the power to flip this switch, because maybe down this road that the train's on, there's all sorts of people. There's 40,000 people on that track. But if you flip this switch, if you break this lock and flip this switch, you could save those 40,000 people. The problem is, do you know that's the right switch? Do you know the switch is even working?
Do you even know that there are people there?
Yeah. Do you know that there's 100,000? There's not 100,000 people on the other track.
I would even.
I mean, it's really kind of like it's so. It doesn't seem like it has enough foresight to really be making these decisions, because there's like, yes, it could be theorized that pulling the lever is going to save 4 people and killing 1. But there is the whole other side that you may not be able to or qualified enough to actually be making those types of decisions.
Now, I'm going to do a little steelman for Saul Alinsky. So if I was Saul Alinsky, I would say to that, well, how much foresight do you really need before you actually do something?
It would be relevant to how much foresight it would need to see the destruction, because both sides are looking at foresight.
I also want to bring up one thing that he did mention, which about foresight, which is he mentioned something about thinking morally in terms of the future and how it will be perceived in the future, and it's impossible to do that, and so you have to kind of think in the present. But
And to give more context to this book, he says, to me, ethics is doing what is best for most, which is basically utilitarian, and is whenever he uses the word ethics in this book, then that's what he's talking about. That's why when he says the ethics of means and ends, it's not ethics, it's doing what is best for most in regards to these rules. That's why I was so curious why he used the word ethics, but he uses that word ethics because by his definition, it is what is best for most. But then you get into the Jordan Peterson scenario where it's, how do you really know what is best for someone? Because unfortunately, we have a unconscious mind, and we are people that sometimes don't even know what's best for ourselves.
yeah.
Yeah, a lot of this book is like the negatives of pragmatism. Because the thing is that Jordan Peterson is a pragmatist, but Saul Alinsky is also a pragmatist. But these are two very different people.
Yeah, and what I think is amazing is Saul Alinsky goes down a road that, would you all agree that, well, I guess we don't have enough evidence yet, but it seems like he goes down a path that leads to less accountability, less virtue, less, morality, and he's treated as if he's some kind of fucking hero. Meanwhile, Jordan Peterson is like, no. Responsibility, virtue, accountability. And he's treated as if he's a fucking demon.
By some people.
Yeah, by some people. Absolutely by some people.
Still a good amount of population that really like Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
Can't ignore them.
Yeah, that's why they're watching the video.
Yeah.
The thing is that, I don't wanna bring this up, but yeah, like the powers that be, so to speak, do generally see him in an unfavorable light.
Yeah, because he's creating a population that's harder to control.
Right, but that's neither here nor there, really.
Okay, go on.
No, I mean, I see with the comparison you're making between Peterson and Alinsky. Alinsky is saying, go out and do what you need to do. Peterson is saying, okay, first sort yourself out, think these things through, and then go out and do what you need to do.
Yeah.
I see it completely
Yep.
So, yeah, I mean, I would obviously go more with the Petersonian approach, but the Alinsky tactics are obviously much more effective, in my opinion.
Yeah.
It's more
I
that they're
think
more
effective.
direct, I'd say. And I think that's kind of the radical problem, in a way. Because the problem with radical movements and radical change is that it is very predicated on immediate action or reform. That if you look at any sort of activism, that's what they want. They want change now. They need the change immediately. And so they will go through radical means. And in that way, if you want to get things done, changed right now, then you would have, then in that way, Saul Alinsky's what he's talking about here, and the methods that he brings up are very conducive to that sort of means. the problem and why we are more favorable to Jordan Peterson is that if you take the Jordan Peterson approach, if you think about it, he has the same sort of outlook or the same sort of goal is to enact change. It's just through different means. It's through a slower means,
Yep.
and that way it's more stable. Whereas a radical change, it has a lot more instability,
And
and the future and outcome of those actions are not going to be as clear.
It's I was just gonna say they both want to try to give people meaning.
Yeah,
sure. It seems like Saul's approach here, I could be mistaken. I certainly could be. It seems like his version of pragmatism is based on efficiency,
Well,
not
hard-
what is actually meaningful.
A harsh reality, I would say.
yeah.
Like he's basically taking like the worst of history and using that as tactics.
That's true.
Because most of these examples, that's what they've been. And so he's saying, hey, this is what people do. So in this sense, if we need to achieve this ends, so to speak, like then this would be the means.
Yeah, then these means he's looking at these means because of the especially in World War II, as these means were effective in getting towards this end. And as such, they are righteous.
Efficiency.
Maybe not efficiency. Well, possibly. I don't know. I just don't see him as I see him as a qualitative, not as quantitative person.
Shall we move on?
All right, moving on. The sixth rule of the ethics of means and ends is that the less important the end to be desired, the more one can afford to engage in ethical evaluation of means.
Let me read that again.
Yeah, one more time.
The sixth rule of the ethics of means and ends is that the less important the end to be desired, the more one can afford to engage in ethical evaluation of means.
Why would it be less important than the end to be desired? They're directly fucking proportional.
No, I think this is completely true. Like, I mean, the less important the end, the more you can afford to be like, oh, what should we do about it? This is literally what the rule is saying. It's saying, okay, the decision is whether we paint the room either blue or green, and then you can have like a lot of time to pontificate on why it should be blue, why it should be green, maybe why you should not paint it at all. You know, like it's a very simple example, but I think it's completely true.
The flip side to that, the pressure you have to change the color of paint of your house compared to the pressure of a authoritarian government coming in and demanding that half of your nation perform labor at the point of a gun. So one, you can take a much more ethical evaluation of compared to the one that is forced at the point of a gun. So that's what this means, I believe, is the less important the end desire, the easier it is to take the time to make an ethical decision to reach those ends.
Yeah, however, the thing with this like proportionality argument, I mean, since it's mathematical, right? I mean, proportionality is mathematical, but you can't then say that the more important the end, like if the end is like infinitely important, well, I wouldn't say infinitely. If the end is like really important, then the means is like whatever, do whatever the fuck you need to do. Like, no. Like, there are some means that are equally as fucked up as some ends, right?
Yeah,
and we can't just like the proportionality has a limit, is what I'm trying to say.
That's for sure. And that's kind of where, every situation needs to be judged accordingly. But if it's a matter of life and death of millions, then, and maybe 1 million people have already died and there's another 1 million on the way, then maybe we can choose to use a less ethical means to stop it than we would in another situation, that being a nuclear bomb and actually killing another 500,000 people.
One thing about the trolley problem is rigged. People don't step back enough to see that. It's like the moral onus is put on the person with the switch in their hands. And you either need to contend with the nature of reality or some nefarious actor, which is actually controlling everything.
Yeah, because the trolley problem is not. It's a test. That's what it was meant to be originally.
Yeah, it's almost like the guy who, there was a guy who tried to prove that life could begin to exist by creating an environment in order to disprove God. It's like, to disprove a creator, he created a thing. It reminds me of that.
It's so odd because he now gives a standard for what he means by ethics, doing what is best for most. Basically, what this quote is basically saying is, well, whatever is more desired by best for most, therefore one cannot afford to gauge in an evaluation of said thing. That action is required. So again, it's I guess a call to arms. So I've had to reframe every time he says ethics, because he gives that what is the utilitarian ethic of what is best for most.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a bait and switch kind of thing.
And I'm going to say even
Double
best
speak.
for most is a little bit of a trick of the language, because he's not necessarily talking about majority.
Oh, that's an excellent point. It's who he imagines.
I'm going to admit I'm lost with you on this one, because most in my mind means majority.
No, it's the way that
Yeah,
Saul is imagining what most means, and it isn't necessarily what is exactly the most. It is what Saul imagines is the most.
Well, it depends on what
I
you
mean, that's true by definition, because he says it in the book, obviously.
Well,
And that's where he's wrong, is that it's what he thinks is best for most, or whatever, or it could be by consensus of what the consensus says is the best for most.
Stanton, did I hit your point correctly?
Yes, you did. And I can give an example. Say slavery as an example, because it's a minority of slaves that still deserves revolutionary acts to stop. Even though it's not best for most people are just fine with the status quo.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm a little lost on it.
It's pigeonholing. It's expecting that the most is only a certain way, and not that the most is actually objectively what the most is.
Yeah. Anyway,
All right.
But the thing is that it's so hard to use the word objectively in this way, because it's a perspectival argument. It's not a. God, this is so confusing. This is so complicated.
And that's kind of my point, actually, because the perspective is kind of in question, and it's up to the reader to actually make the decision.
That's true. Yep, that is true.
And the reader is coaxed in a certain direction, and that's just basic rhetoric. Of course, you want to do that when you're writing a book.
Well, I mean, you could make the argument that most authors do that.
Yeah.
And that's an objective most.
All
right, I'll stop. I'm sorry.
Anyway, sorry, I get hung up with the word objective because I use the James Lindsay definition of objective, where people agree with it. Like, not just one person, but multiple people will agree with something. Therefore, it makes it objective. You have an object, an objective.
Wait, we're not going to get into objective, subjective.
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
No. I'm just saying.
I could do this for an hour. Let's
Hold
read.
All I'm saying is that for the people out there, when I think of the word objective, that is typically what I think of. If you want to talk about it, we can. I'm just letting everyone know that's what I think of when I think of objective. It is that a group of people agreeing with something.
All right. I disagree with
the common
you, but...
Anyway, Continuing. The seventh rule of the ethics of means and ends is that generally success or failure is a mighty determinant of ethics. The judgment of history leans heavily on the outcome of success or failure. It spells the difference between the traitor and the patriotic hero. There can be no such thing as a successful traitor, for if one succeeds, he becomes a founding father.
I
Yeah.
am so tempted to bring objectivity back into this, but I'm not going to.
Don't you dare! This is actually something that I've already said. Like I felt he was kind of leaning to earlier. The seventh rule is means and ends, generally success or failure being the determinant of the ethics. So it's the winners decide if they are making an ethical decision. So as long as you win, you can rationalize your ethics to that point.
All right.
Well, it's again, he used his definition for ethics, what is best for most. So if there's someone who is considered a traitor, but he does what is the best for the most people, then he becomes a founding father because he was the most ethical. That's what the statement is. Because the thing is that you don't want, if you're a traitor to something that's unethical, then you don't care about the people being unethical calling you a traitor. That's what this quote is about.
But I mean, that's still being a traitor. It's not saying that it's not being a traitor. It's saying that if you become the traitor and you win, you become the founding father.
No, that is true.
But what I think Saul is kind of ignoring here is, again, principles. And it's like, if you're going to be a traitor and you're going to be subversive, you're going to be an outright liar, you're going to be a hypocrite, you're going to abandon virtue and moral principle, just because you win does not make you ethical.
Well,
you can have the appearance of that. Yes, sure.
Well, the thing is, you technically could be a traitor without having to do any of those things. Because you technically could be a traitor without abandoning your own principles.
Okay, so
if your own principles get are not aligned with whatever you are a traitor against or something.
People in Nazi-occupied territory who were hiding Jews, they were acting ethically.
Yeah, well, yes, I would say that they were acting ethically. Yeah, this argument was a critique against Immanuel Kant for his system of morality.
Fucking Kant.
Well, Kant's a very smart guy. I would not downplay Kant at all.
I had to learn that Nietzsche was very intelligent. It took me a while, and then as soon as I saw it, I was like, "Holy shit, this guy's a fucking genius."
Yeah, honestly, a lot of people that Alinsky mentions in this book are incredibly smart people. So Alinsky, he knows his stuff.
Yeah.
And Alinsky himself, he is a smart guy.
Mm-hmm.
So anyone reading this book, do not get the illusion that Alinsky is dumb by any stretch of the imagination.
I don't know. I think we need to get a little bit farther in before anybody makes up their mind if they believe that Saul was actually believing what he was putting down or if he was just pushing an agenda. I'm under the impression that he wasn't pushing an agenda.
Well, the thing is that Saul Alinsky, he did a lot of stuff he was an activist. Like what he did is he would basically go to a certain group, he would see what they wanted, and then he would help with that group, try to basically help them make change for the group so that way they could get what they needed. So he would go to poor groups or certain activist groups and basically work with them. Like he worked with a lot of different organizations. So a lot of the stuff that he talks about, he probably put some of that in practice.
Sure.
The eighth rule of the ethics of means and ends is that the morality of a means depends upon whether the means is being employed at a time of imminent defeat or imminent victory. The same means employed with victory seemingly assured may be defined as immoral, whereas if it had been used in desperate circumstances to avert defeat, the question of morality would never arise. In short, ethics are determined by whether one is losing or winning.
No.
From the beginning of time, killing has always been regarded as justifiable if committed in self-defense. Let us confront this principle with the most awful ethical question of modern times. Did the United States have the right to use the atomic bomb at Hiroshima? When we dropped the atomic bomb, the United States was assured of victory. In the Pacific, Japan had suffered an unbroken succession of defeats. Now we were in Okinawa with an air base from which we could bomb the enemy around the clock. The Japanese Air Force was decimated, as was their Navy. Victory had come in Europe, and the entire European Air Force, Navy, and Army were released for use in the Pacific. Russia was moving in for a cut of the spoils. Defeat for Japan was an absolute certainty, and the only question was how and when the coup de grace would be administered. For familiar reasons, we dropped the bomb and triggered off as well a universal debate on the morality of the issue of this means for the end of finishing the war.
No.
I submit that if the atomic bomb had been developed shortly after Pearl Harbor, when we stood defenseless, when most of our Pacific fleet was at the bottom of the sea, when the nation was fearful of invasion on the Pacific coast, when we were committed as well to the war in Europe, that then the use of the bomb at that time on Japan would have been universally heralded as a just retribution of hail, fire, and brimstone. Then the use of the bomb would have been hailed as proof that good inevitably triumphs over evil. The question of the ethics of the use of the bomb would never have arisen at that time, and the character of the present debate would have been very different. Those who would disagree with this assertion have no memory of the state of the world at that time. They are either fools or liars, or both.
Okay, I do have to say, can I say something?
Dude.
I do agree with that here. Like, completely. Well, not completely. I do agree that the bomb was extremely unethical, and I do disagree with the use of the atomic bomb in general. I believe it is a deterrent. I believe that, yeah, we know it's a deterrent because it has been used twice, and only twice. And
Thank God
yeah,
for that, by the way.
and that's the reason we live in what some historians call our era the Great Peace, because no two major powers have been at war since World War II because of the nuclear bomb. However, yeah, I completely disagree with the use of it in 1945. I do believe Japan was completely blockaded, and there was nothing they could do. And there was nothing we had to do. We could have just starved them out.
I do agree with that. However, I've had this conversation before with as I'm sure a lot of people have had conversations about the big bomb. The thing is, when we're talking about is that when I look at it, and look at it in a sort of I like to look at the geopolitical stuff and especially when talking about the nuke in more of a common human way. In like you have it's we basically spent the entire war developing this arms race, and with Germany they made the fucking V2 rocket, and so we were like, okay, we gotta one up that, and everyone's like, we gotta one up that and that because we all have to try and get that edge, something to be the strongest in order to survive.
Right, so the arms race that always happens when war happens. Yeah, like more vehicles, like more weaponry and vehicles was developed in World War II than we have had. Like we've used the same tank for 40 years, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, with modifications, of course, but
right. Well, World War II, we entered with one tank and we left with very different design of what we entered with. Like extremely different. A lot of
because the fucking Sherman sucks, and especially when we went into other wars, and especially with the Gulf War and in the Middle East, we found out that some of these treads don't really work too well in sand, So we gotta kind of work with that. But the point that I wanted to make in regards to the nuke is that we had created this bomb, and we had done tests, and we knew in a degree what it could do, but there was no. In a way, it's like it's like the scenario of the gun under the table thing. You have this big fucking threat,
Yeah,
but no one knows about it. And you're just waiting to pull the trigger. If you're looking at it like the war's about to be over, we have this big fuck off bomb. Like, we should use it. We have to try it. And I do believe that if we didn't use it then, we would have definitely used it later. There would be no reason for us to not use it later. And if we think about it in that way, what would the repercussions of that have been?
Well,
Because then would we have to wait for another war? Would we have dropped the nukes in the Middle East? Would we have actually reached a nuclear war with Russia? That have actually happened if we hadn't known the fucking gravity of what it was able to accomplish with Japan.
Well, you can ask those types of questions ad infinitum, but I completely disagree with what you just said.
I don't think it's fucking good at all. Like, I don't fucking support the bomb at all. It's just a thought.
gun under the table, yes.
I'm not disagreeing with the bomb part. Like, we both agree the bomb was unethical. What we're saying is that what you're saying is that if we didn't use the bomb, we would have faced other issues in the different issues and more present issues in the future. And I don't agree with that because we cannot speculate as what would have happened.
It's like saying that if we didn't use it then it would have been used in even more unethical standards. And sure, fair enough.
Listen, I don't agree because the bomb was used specifically on civilian targets, and
that fucking pisses me off.
I don't. This is what I'm saying. Like Hiroshima, I don't remember if it was Hiroshima or Nagasaki. One of them was the religious center of Japan, and the other was, I think, the economic center of Japan. So they deliberately attacked the religious center of Japan just to completely demoralize them.
That was,
yeah.
I have never heard a compelling argument to say why we shouldn't have just dropped the nuke off the coast where it didn't kill anybody. I've never heard a compelling argument against that.
Radiation in the water?
Well, radiation in the water or radiation and destroying, 500,000 people?
I have heard and I would be interested in your guys' opinion on this. It's not really that I also support this opinion, but it would be an opposing opinion to the bomb, is that Japan at the time of the war, given that the Japanese culture was basically a fight until you die type culture.
Oh, yeah.
And basically what was happening is that a lot of even civilians at the time on land were being trained for military use. Because the
same thing happened in Germany.
Well, yeah, hold on. Because of how the war was going. So it could be that you have, I guess, a trolley problem. Do you drop the bomb and end the war? Or do you continue a bloody war where more people continue to die, where it slowly trickles down until Japan is annihilated by all sides?
Yes, that is compelling. But it almost seems as if it's only option A or option B. What about option C? Why not a show of power rather than killing so many people?
But here's the thing: the people who made these decisions I don't think it was just we just have these two options. They probably had to factor in as many different things as possible.
Imagine irradiating all of the seawater. Maybe it leaks into the rivers, and you end up killing the whole fucking country instead of just two cities, which is awful.
And the fucking economic wildlife.
What is the most ethical way to drop the bomb to end the killing of the majority of people? Kill 500,000 people to stop 1 million people from dying.
Oh,
can I submit an answer?
Sure.
Okay, I don't know when. Maybe my timetable is completely wrong. But hear me out. Maybe you don't invade Iwo Jima. Maybe you drop the nuke on Iwo Jima. Again, I don't know when the bomb was made, but Iwo Jima was a military base.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there's a lot of history that we would have to read in order to understand the whole Bible situation.
Oh, absolutely.
The whole thing about like the Japanese fought to death. Okay, that's propaganda. Also, the whole thing about like they were training their soldiers to fight. Yeah, like so did Hitler and so did the Germans. Like everybody was fighting in Germany. Women, children, mothers, old people, and we went in there and we fucking teared them up without a blip. This whole like argument about more people would have died, that is a non-argument to me, because we did the same thing in Germany months prior to that. So again, like I don't think there was a justification. I think they did it because it was convenient and because they wanted to see the effects on a population.
Yeah, but if you were asking what would be the most ethical solution for dropping the bomb and showing as a show of force, I think that the easy answer is to release footage of the testing and showing how fucking strong this thing is. But the problem with that there is how effective would that be in
Also, they
showing...
didn't.
They knew. It wasn't a secret.
How are you going to get that footage to them? There wasn't the internet. Like,
all right. We could run through 100 hypotheticals of what they could do. The only way you could, and I'm going to suggest everyone to answer this question, is to read up on the history of it more.
Okay.
And then we could come back to a conversation like this and then talk about the whole history of the bomb.
But I watched Letters from Iwo Jima, and I saw it. I was there.
that's a great movie, by the way.
It is a great movie.
If anyone wants to see like what was happening toward the end of the war with Japan, Letters from Iwo Jima by Clint Eastwood, great movie.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
All right.
So
Moving on.
back to the 8th rule, because we never even talked about the rule. We just talked about the nukes.
The nukes.
The 8th rule of ethics: means and ends. Morality of a means dependent upon whether the means is being employed at the time of imminent defeat or imminent victory. What this is saying and what this is rationalizing is if you're a victim, you can get away with less ethical means.
I think it's well, a lot of these rules I perceive them as tactical rules, but I think it's really just a timing thing. Like you basically want to time it to achieve your means as best as possible.
Yeah.
I think that's plain and simple what it is. And a little fact, Nikeia, I believe in Greek, is the word for victory. Or it's either Greek or Roman, one of the two. But so you have Philia Nikeia. And then the opposite of that would be Sophia, which is the word for wisdom. So you have the love of wisdom versus the love of victory. So basically, there is a stark contrast between Philia Nikeia and Philia Sophia. Saul Alinsky definitely, in this chapter, is more focused on winning rather than administering a wisdom. A lot of it is tactics. That's why I consider this book more political science rather than something along the lines of a philosophy book.
Okay, I can see that.
See, my point, as a tactic, you want to have the view that you are being victimized. So then you can do things to counter that victimization and still feel like you're in the moral right about it and still be viewed like you're in the moral right about it and staying on the right side of the public.
Right.
So,
yeah, I think that's absolutely what he's saying.
Yeah, so that's the tactic side of it, for sure.
Yeah.
So as long as you can be that, and we can see a lot of this with the rioting and how the media is kind of framing it in a way that is towards the people that are framing themselves as the losers and framing themselves as being the oppressed, and they're doing stuff to fight the man, fight the oppression, fight the horrible status quo to do what they can to actually put in the change that they want to see.
It's all Mad Dog justification.
Yes.
Yeah. And well, the thing is that you could, I mean, technically, if we're on the topic of victimhood, you technically could be like adhering to principles and at the same time being the victim.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
It really, I mean, as far as victimhood goes, now, and I'm just going to say this, I have seen both sides of the political aisle using the victimhood strategy. both, especially in lefties, and there are definitely some conservatives out there who will also use this victim strategies. Both ways are incredibly different.
Yes.
And both sides will time it just right. I just see it as a tactic. It's basically saying time your tactics when you're the victim of imminent defeat. So, anyway.
What I still can't get over is the dude is like, yeah, you do need to abandon principle. Well, what kind of fucking world are you going to build if you're a revolutionary, you get your revolution done, and you didn't use principles to get it done? What kind of world are you going to build that's not based on principles?
It would be what's best for most people.
And then again, it comes back to what do you define as most people?
All right, continuing on. The 9th rule of the ethics of means and ends is that any effective means is automatically judged by the opposition as being unethical. One of our greatest revolutionary heroes was Francis Marion of South Carolina, who became immortalized in American history as the Swamp Fox. Marion was an outright revolutionary guerrilla. He and his men operated according to the traditions and with all of the tactics commonly associated with the present-day guerrillas. Cornwallis and the regular British Army found their plans and operations harried and disorganized by Marion's guerrilla tactics. Infuriated by the effectiveness of his operations and incapable of coping with them, the British denounced him as a criminal and charged that he did not engage in warfare like a gentleman or a Christian. He was subjected to an unremitting denunciation about his lack of ethics and morality for his use of guerrilla means to the end of winning the revolution.
The idea that no matter what you do, it's going to be judged unethical by the opposition is one thing, and that's not always true, not even close to being always true. It may be you will be shown to be on the unethical side because they're looking at it from a different perspective, just like you see it as being totally something that you can rationalize. Well, they don't see your rationale as being valid if they even see it at all. But following up with an example of someone actually being complained about being unethical and using guerrilla warfare is kind of saying a different thing than what it started off as. Because if you're saying off the bat that you're automatically going to be judged as being unethical, and then your example is someone being unethical, you're not really proving the point that you are being judged incorrectly.
Mm-hmm.
It's just you have a different rationalization for those unethical actions.
Well, it's like when the Germans complained that the Americans were using shotguns in World War One, right?
Oh yeah.
Like, I mean, what do you want me to say? Like, what you're like, you oppose the way the shotgun kills you versus the way a rifle kills you? I mean,
You're saying that you're opposed to them being more efficient than you guys?
Yeah, how dare you now? What? Now let us just gas bomb you.
Well,
I guess I will give him to this on this one. I guess I mean, because if the result is the same thing, I don't know, man. Like I have a lot of words in this one.
Prepare to
Go
win.
ahead.
What's this bullshit?
Yeah. The problem is what it rationalizes and what it makes it so when you see opposition, you can tell yourself, hey, no, that's just them saying I'm being unethical because they're my opposition. Of course they're going to say that. That's what Saul said.
Mm-hmm.
So no matter it, you can't use other people's perspective as a judgment on whether or not you're on the right path anymore. And that's dangerous because you could spiral out of control and lose public opinion, but still have in your mind think that you are doing the right thing and you're going to be winning because they're just the ones that are opposed to you. So of course they're going to say,
They're just haters.
yeah, that's the thing. They're just haters. And when it's like, yeah, I guess, but it's a dangerous thing to constantly think of without having any perspective. Because if you want to be, and this kind of goes against what he said earlier in the book, because if you want to have a actual revolution, you need to understand the opposition. And when the opposition is judging you and saying it, and you're not actually understanding understanding the opposition anymore. You are going against the opposition because it's assumed that they are going to be incorrect about what you think.
Well, Saul Alinsky, I believe in the previous chapter, did say that you also have to understand your opposition in order to have a efficient. Yeah, exactly. Actually, I heard somewhere that this book is very much influenced by the whole Art of War thing, Sun Tzu's Art of War.
And that's,
it definitely shows.
This is the biggest problem that I'm having with these tactics and everything, is rather than saying, here's how we can end war, it's, oh, here's how you can actually, win the war. No. I thought the objective was to end war. And he's just saying, no, this is the best way to win.
This book is not about ending war at all.
Of course not.
Well, the book is about basically how to seize power.
Yeah, and
for the have-nots.
What's the best way to do that? It's not through warfare. It's not through these tactics. It's certainly not. It's definitely not this.
But if you've got a bunch of have-nots that want something, you got to give them something. And that's like a harsh reality that Saul Alinsky puts in his book. I'm trying to steelman Saul Alinsky a little bit.
Yeah, that's true. You do need to please the have-nots. But I don't think that... I don't think that the way to do that is to convince the have-nots that they are morally justified in abandoning principles. I don't think it's right.
Now, I'm going to steelman Saul Alinsky a little bit more. He would say that that's what the have a little but want more would say.
No, convenient.
So what you just said.
Convenient that.
But that is what he would say. Going back to that first chapter, he said that the haves, what we'll do is saying, well, the have-nots are just being immoral, and so they're suddenly justifying their own positions for their own status quo.
Well, God, his ends and means thing is just baffling me.
You're dealing with a battle of wants, what people want.
And not what is actually pragmatic and best for people. It's just his imagination of whatever most is. Well, I don't know.
What's best for most? The 10th rule of the ethics of means and ends is that you do what you can with what you have and clothe it with moral garments. In the field of action, the first question that arises in the determination of means to be employed for particular ends is what means are available. This requires an assessment of whatever strengths or resources are present and can be used. It involves sifting the multiple factors which combine in creating the circumstances at any given time, and an adjustment to the popular views and the popular climate. Questions such as how much time is necessary or available must be considered. Who and how many will support the action? Does the opposition possess the power to the degree that it can suspend or change laws? Does its control of police power extend to the point where legal and orderly change is impossible? If weapons are needed, then are appropriate weapons available? Availability of means determines whether you will be underground or above ground, whether you will move quickly or slowly, whether you will move for extensive changes or limited adjustments, whether you will move by passive resistance or active resistance, or whether you will move at all. The absence of any means might drive one to martyrdom in the hope that this would be a catalyst, starting a chain reaction that would culminate in a mass movement. Here, a simple ethical statement is used as a means to power. A naked illustration of this point is to be found in Trotsky's summary of Lenin's famous April Theses, issued shortly after Lenin's return from exile. Lenin pointed out, the task of the Bolsheviks is to overthrow the imperialist government, but this government rests upon the support of the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks, who in turn are supported by the trustfulness of the masses of people. We are in the minority. In these circumstances, there could be no talk of violence on our side. The essence of Lenin's speeches during this period was, they have the guns, and therefore we are for peace and for reformation through the ballot. When we have the guns, then it will be through the bullet. And it was. Mahatma Gandhi and his use of passive resistance in India presents a striking example of the selection of means. Here, too, we see the inevitable alchemy of time working upon moral equivalence as a consequence of the changing circumstances and positions of the have-nots to the haves, with the natural shift of goals from getting to keeping. Gandhi is viewed by the world as the epitome of the highest moral behavior with respect to means and ends. We can assume that there are those who would believe that if Gandhi had lived, there would never have been an invasion of Goa or any other armed invasion. Similarly, the politically naive would have regarded it as unbelievable that the great apostle of nonviolence, Nehru, would ever have countenanced the invasion of Goa, for it was Nehru who stated in 1955, "What are the basic elements of our policy in regard to Goa? First, there must be peaceful methods. This is essential unless we give up the roots of all our policies and all our behavior. We rule out non-peaceful methods entirely. He was a man committed to nonviolence and ostensibly to the love of mankind, including his enemies. His end was the independence of India from foreign domination, and his means was that of passive resistance. History and religious and moral opinion have so enshrined Gandhi in this sacred matrix that in many quarters it is blasphemous to question whether this entire procedure of passive resistance was not simply the only intelligent, realistic, expedient program which Gandhi had at his disposal, and that the morality which surrounded this policy of passive resistance was to a large degree a rationale to cloak a pragmatic program with a desired and essential moral cover."
Okay, yeah, Tibet is kind of fucked because they're so passive. But along that vein, who do I remember about Tiananmen Square? Who do I remember? The guy who was standing in front of the fucking tank. And that guy was standing on principles. Of course, he was dragged off and shot later, but like that's the bit that really sticks in my memory. Probably because humans are moral creatures, and we tend to, we do tend to make good guys bad guys out of propaganda, but I think there's also a deeper level of good guys, bad guys. And in the example of Tiananmen Square, the guy who was standing in front of the tank, that guy certainly stands out as more of a good guy. Was he firing RPGs at the tanks? No. Like, it's almost like a Christ figure. The most moral person is sacrificed for the greater good of the whole, and just it's celebrated.
I definitely see what you're saying. I highlighted that quote by Lenin because I thought it's very relevant to what's happening today.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, I hesitate to draw parallels with contemporary issues, but there's definitely a side that's playing the victim really hard, and well, maybe not in recent months, but
Well, we know who is the martyrs, so the absence of means has shown martyrs and brought them to the surface. And these martyrs are being used as catalysts, and they are starting chain reactions that are accumulating in mass movements.
Mhm.
The direction of that mass movement is still one of those things. Like I said, it's to be determined. It's in flux constantly.
Well, being the underdog is a tactic because it's almost it's playing on victimhood, but victimhood is tying into morality,
Definitely.
and
That's why it works.
what happens when the underdog abandons morality and uses, let's say in this example, and I know it's been said a handful of times, the master's tools.
They're cheered.
Well, I mean, if you're, by definition, if you're a victim, that means you are subject to some sort of injustice.
Oh, yeah. But it's like, it's almost like people have a problem with the rule for eye for an eye, right? And that is, equivalent justice. But people are saying, no, we got to do a little bit better than that. Just translate that into your revolution. Rather than eye for an eye, you shoot somebody with tear gas or something like that, and they're incapacitated. They can't do anything. Like, give them medical care. Treat them.
In regards to the protesters, it does seem like they're putting themselves in harm's way without having a clear goal. But now that you mention it, the goal seems to be getting that victim power, that victim narrative to further justify their violence. But the problem is, well, the modern times, and that everything they do is being recorded and being put under the
And it's out for
microscope.
everyone to judge.
Yeah, exactly.
Even if they think it's moral, those that are able to see it are able to disagree.
It's what is it? Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's two people. Number one is there's the people themselves who feel like they are actually victimized. And then there is the straight white males who stand up for the victimized people to virtue signal. If you catch my drift.
That is such a subversive thing.
Because I also would like to say, I would also like to say that your tactics and your goals should also be dependent on your circumstance, because that's what I find. Gandhi, for example, I think he was able to change stuff by being peaceful, and it's very, how could I say this? I admire that, but also we gotta recognize that the British Empire was broke after World War. What was it, 1 or 2?
I think probably. Oh,
yeah, both of them. And so Gandhi understood that he could win without being super violent because he understood his opponent, and that's something
he
I wish.
recognized that it was unnecessary.
Right. Yeah. That's something I wish more people understood in terms of fighting for change. Is like you gotta understand your circumstance. If you're fighting a militarized, oppressive government, like by all means, you need to sort of equal. You gotta come at them with equal strength. But if you want to fight for human rights and all that in a first world country, well, maybe a Molotov is not needed.
What better way to say that you want to protect people and property by destroying somebody else's?
To bring it back to Saul, though, I will say I do appreciate his point about circumstance, and it's dealing with what you have. Although it is a very controversial take that he says that essentially Gandhi wasn't just doing that because it was moral, or he saw that was an effective means for that time, but he was saying that if I think he's essentially saying if Gandhi had a gun, it would have been different.
Actually, that appears later in the book.
Oh, does he give Gandhi a gun? I hope he does.
Lord.
Give Gandhi a gun.
Not exactly the same thing, but we'll get to that hurdle when we get to it. Sorry, you came across a point that I knew was going to be there ahead of time, so I had to stop you to preserve you.
Gandhi too.
What I'm really finding interesting is I really agreed with Saul for the prelude and chapter 1, and I was expecting that it would take longer for our ideas to diverge. And it's just chapter 2 where the dude just completely diverts from my idea of the proper way to do things. Like, I don't know, Saul is almost coming across like a Vosh figure to me right now.
Wait, are you saying that there's a radical that sounds reasonable at first, but then once they start to actually talk and explain their methods, you start to realize they're crazy or not right?
That is what I mean, yes. And for Vosh's sake, when I first heard him starting to articulate ideas about whatever form of socialism he was going on about, the way that he put it forth, I thought was considerably better than these, like, dumbass fucking, like, ideologically led, what did Destiny call them? Barrel of rocks or something like that, barrel of stones or something, like leftists, just completely out of their fucking mind, ideologically led. It seemed like there was a lot of thought put into things, and hey man, I can actually listen to this. And then you start to see the character coming through, you start to see the methodology coming through, and it's like, oh, I'm going to claim to be moral. Oh, by the way, there's no such thing as morality. Wait, what? Those who win claim morality. No, I don't think it's as simple as that, dude. I really don't.
We'll be right back for more flipping through after a quick break.
Ha! We're back. We've got the Gartham.
Hello, how's it going?
And Stanton.
Hello.
But we also have two new people to the conversation here, which is, hello, Sasquatch.
Greetings.
And then we have Spoon,
How you doing?
the man with a velvety voice.
Thank you very much.
We also have Jose.
Thanks for having me.
Yep, and for those who are listening, this is part 2 of chapter 2 of Means and Ends for Rules for Radicals. Let us examine this case. First, Gandhi, like any other leader in the field of social action, was compelled to examine the means at hand. If he had had guns, he might well have used them in an armed revolution against the British, which would have been in keeping with the traditions of revolutions for freedom through force. Gandhi did not have guns, and if he had had the guns, he would not have had the people to use the guns. Gandhi records in his autobiography his astonishment at the passivity and submissiveness of his people in not retaliating or even wanting revenge against the British. As I proceed further and further with my inquiry into the atrocities that have been committed on my people, I came across tales of government's tyranny and the arbitrary despotism of its officers, such as I was hardly prepared for, and they filled me with deep pain. What surprised me then, and what still continues to fill me with surprise, was the fact that a province that had furnished the largest number of soldiers to the British government during the war should have taken all these brutal excesses lying down. Gandhi and his associates repeatedly deplored the inability of their people to give organized, effective, violent resistance against injustice and tyranny. His own experience was corroborated by an unbroken series of reiterations from all the leaders of India that India could not practice physical warfare against her enemies. Many reasons were given, including weakness, lack of arms, having been beaten into submission, and other arguments of a similar nature. Interviewed by Norman Cousins in 1961, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru described the Hindus of these days as a demoralized, timid, and hopeless mass bullied and crushed by every dominant interest and incapable of resistance. Faced with this situation, we revert for a moment to Gandhi's assessment and review of the means available to him. It has been stated that if he had had the guns, he might have used them. This statement is based on the Declaration of Independence of Mahatma Gandhi issued on January 26, 1930, where he discussed the fourfold disaster to our country. His fourth indictment against the British reads, "Spiritually compulsory disarmament has made us unmanly, and the presence of an alien army of occupation employed with deadly effect to crush in us the spirit of resistance has made us think we cannot look after ourselves or put up a defense against foreign aggression, or even defend our homes and families." These words more than suggests that if Gandhi had had the weapons for violent resistance and the people to use them, this means would not have been so unreservedly rejected as the world would like to think. On the same point, we might note that once India had secured independence, when Nehru was faced with a dispute with Pakistan over Kashmir, he did not hesitate to use armed force. Now the power arrangements had changed. India had the guns and the trained army to use these weapons. Any suggestion that Gandhi would not have approved the use of violence is negated by Nehru's own statement in the 1961 interview. It was a terrible time. When the news reached me about Kashmir, I knew I would have to act at once with force. Yet I was greatly troubled in mind and spirit because I knew we might have to face a war so soon after having achieved our independence through a philosophy of nonviolence. It was horrible to think of, yet I acted. Gandhi said nothing to indicate his disapproval. It was a great relief, I must say. If Gandhi, the vigorous nonviolent, didn't demur, it made my job a lot easier. This strengthened my view that Gandhi could be adaptable. Confronted with the issue of what means he could employ against the British, we come to the other criteria previously mentioned. That the kind of means selected and how they can be used is significantly dependent upon the face of the enemy, or the character of his opposition. Gandhi's opposition not only made the effective use of passive resistance possible, but practically invented it. His enemy was a British administration characterized by an old aristocratic liberal tradition, one which granted a good deal of freedom to its colonials, and which always had operated on a pattern of using, absorbing, seducing, or destroying through flattery or corruption the revolutionary leaders who arose from the colonial ranks. This was the kind of opposition that would have tolerated and ultimately capitulated before the tactic of passive resistance. Gandhi's passive resistance would never have had a chance against a totalitarian state such as that of the Nazis. It is dubious whether under these circumstances the idea of passive resistance would even have occurred to Gandhi. It has been pointed out that Gandhi, who was born in 1869, never saw or understood totalitarianism, and defined his opposition completely in terms of the character of the British government and what it represented. George Orwell, in his essay Reflection on Gandhi, made some pertinent observations on this point. He believed in arousing the world, which is only possible if the world gets a chance to hear what you are doing. It is difficult to see how Gandhi's methods could be applied in a country where opponents of the regime despair in the middle of the night and are never heard from again. Without a free press and the right of assembly, it is impossible not merely to appeal to outside opinion, but to bring a mass movement into being, or even to make your intentions known to your adversary.
I wonder if, given the chance, Saul would say, like, well, Christ actually was advocating for being peaceful and improving yourself, but if he had the chance to use violence, he would have.
I think Saul makes that point because Gandhi, in his declaration, basically implied that he would have used non-peaceful ways.
He's going to
fair
become
enough.
a sort of Muhammad type figure. He himself went on a sort of warfare against other Arabian tribes. It's interesting to think about, to be honest. I don't think Gandhi would have pushed his movement in a peaceful way during the under the foot of the Nazis. Oh.
There's also another thing to consider about Gandhi. Gandhi is definitely not the same kind of archetype as say, Christ. There's a lot of crap going around, like he was probably actually a pedophile and stuff like that. I don't know how accurate that is, but it should be considered that this guy, I mean, he is being almost like sanctified in a way of, going for passive-aggressive or passive ways of solving problems. But the history of the man still remains, and he could actually have been a sociopath.
He could have been a megalomaniac, is what you mean. Not necessarily.
And used whatever means possible within the system that he was working in order to achieve those gains or achieve that status that he was going for.
even if self-imposed fasting,
The
and
thing
sort of
that-
convince other people.
Well, the thing that caught my attention is he kind of crushes the whole idea of Gandhi being a pacifist, because that might have been what happened in history, but he kind of makes it clear it wasn't really his choice. It was something that came to, essentially it fell in his lap as his best option, and he just did that. And that kind of fits in with the rest of what Saul is talking about.
Yep.
Of choosing the right means for the right ends, and using what is given to you to the best of your advantage, and still being able to reach the conclusion that you want, even though it seems like you might not have half the tools that are required to reach those ends.
Well, I wonder if it, because I wonder if the means in Gandhi's sense is also reflective of like the Indian culture too. So in a sense, like if you have an armed rebellion, so well, I don't know. I don't know much about Indian history, so maybe I shouldn't say that. But one point that he brings up is that the reason of what Gandhi did, why he did it, is because of a certain disgust that he had. And I think Saul talks about this in, what was it? Oh, here we go. Spiritually compulsory disarmament has made us unmanly, and the presence of an alien army of occupation employed with deadly effect to crush us in the spirit of resistance has made us to think we cannot look after ourselves or put up a defense against foreign aggression or even defend our homes and families. So from this point of view, that Gandhi is thinking that he feels that his people, so to speak, are essentially defeated. And so there is a sense of disgust as far as the reasons of why he does what he does. Yeah, this is interesting. As far as would Gandhi, a lot of this is so hypothetical, but would Gandhi have been violent if that's what he had to do? Like, is it more based on the principle of the thing, or is it more of like a bigger political picture? Although I don't know how political Gandhi was.
I don't know too much about Indian history, but I think I understand the point Saul was trying to make.
It's maximal efficiency, right? Like just being pragmatic. It's not morally founded. It's not.
Yes, right.
That's the problem that I have with his idea of ends and means. I mean, he definitely is bringing up something that is true about the nature of humanity, which is, man, people are going to take the shortest way to, or the easiest way, the most effective way to get to the freaking ends that they want. But it's almost as if he's completely and utterly ignoring the moral element to it. It's almost as if, oh yeah, you're morally correct from the get-go. Actually, you know what? Morals don't even fucking exist. They're fuck them. You know, your power, your cause, whatever you find effective, or the way that you want the world to be, just fucking make it work. And use any means possible. Use the most efficient means possible. There's no fucking moral incentive to any of it.
Well, Saul Alinsky, what was it, earlier in this chapter, he says that his form of ethics is the greatest amount of happiness with the least amount of suffering.
Kind of sounds like bullshit to me.
Well, it's...
That's not bullshit. That's the laws of trade-offs.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't believe him when he says that. I really don't.
I don't know. That's what people say, but is that really what they mean? Like, of course, everybody wants that. The most amount of happiness with the least amount of suffering. Like, it's a total cop-out answer, in my opinion.
Especially if it's only my way is the best way to get to this way.
Did Gandhi do what he did because of moral reasons, or was it a purely pragmatic sense?
Well, I think he did what he did for moral reasons. I don't know. I think he absolutely did.
And there's kind of a difference here, because I feel like your options are limited when you're playing in the defensive. Gandhi was trying to be a defensive against foreign aggression as best as he possibly could. where revolutionary is typically on the attack.
Oh, I see what you mean.
So there's a bit of a difference when it comes to the moral argument here.
I don't know. A lot of this is it's just very hypothetical. That's what's so hard to analyze this section, because in the last paragraph that they read, it's like, well, under the Nazis, like, yeah, right. But at the same time, it's like, that's hypothetical. It's like, we'll never know. So it's just not a convincing argument in that way. And I think I mentioned this before in one of our previous sessions, that a lot of this book is more like it's trying to get you to look at a perspective rather than something that is more of a logical argument, so to speak.
Yes.
Which is why it's so hard to talk about this book.
Yeah, I think so. Like, it's all, like, as we have said before, like, it's all pragmaticism. Like, it's really hard to argue against from a pragmatic perspective. But, from a principled perspective, obviously, like, you can tear this book apart. But that's not what this book is trying to say.
From a pragmatic point of view, passive resistance was not only possible, but was the most effective means that could have been selected for the end of ridding India of British control. In organizing, the major negative in the situation has to be converted into the leading positive. In short, knowing that one could not expect violent action from this large and torpid mass, Gandhi organized the inertia. He gave it a goal so that it became purposeful. Their wide familiarity with Dharma made passive resistance no longer to the Hindustani. To oversimplify, what Gandhi did was to say, look, you are all sitting there anyway, so instead of sitting there, why don't you sit over here, and while you're sitting, say, independence now. This raises another question about the morality of means and ends. We have already noted that, in essence, mankind divides itself into three groups: the have-nots, the have-a-little, want-mores, and the haves. The purpose of the haves is to keep what they have. Therefore, the haves want to maintain the status quo and the have-nots to change it. The haves develop their own morality to justify their means of repression and all other means employed to maintain the status quo. The haves usually establish laws and judges devoted to maintaining the status quo. Since any effective means of changing the status quo are usually illegal and or unethical in the eyes of the establishment. Have-nots, from the beginning of time, have been compelled to appeal to a law higher than man-made law. Then, when the have-nots achieve success and become the haves, they are in the position of trying to keep what they have, and their morality shifts with their change of location in the power pattern. 8 months after securing independence, the Indian National Congress outlawed passive resistance and made it a crime. It was one thing for them to use the means of passive resistance against the previous haves, but now in power, they were going to ensure that this means would not be used against them. No longer, as have-nots, were they appealing to laws higher than man-made law. Now that they were making the laws, they were on the side of man-made laws. Hunger strikes, used so effectively in the revolution, were viewed differently now, too. Nehru, in the interview mentioned above, said, "The government will not be influenced by hunger strikes. To tell the truth, I didn't approve of fasting as a political weapon even when Gandhi practiced it." Again, Sam Adams, the firebrand radical of the American Revolution, provides a clear example. Adams was foremost in proclaiming the right of revolution. However, following the success of the American Revolution, it was the same Sam Adams who was foremost in demanding the execution of those Americans who participated in Shays' Rebellion, charging that no one had a right to engage in revolution against us. Moral rationalization is indispensable at all times of action, whether to justify the selection or the use of ends or means. Machiavelli's blindness to the necessity for moral clothing to all acts and motives, he said, "Politics has no relation to morals," was his major weakness. All great leaders, including Churchill, Gandhi, Lincoln, and Jefferson, always invoked moral principles to cover naked self-interest in the clothing of freedom, equality of mankind, a higher law than man-made law, and so on. This even held under circumstances of national crisis when it was universally assumed that the end justified any means. All effective actions require the passport of morality.
One of the things that's been bothering me about Saul's way of explaining the nature of the world with the haves, the have a little but want more, and the have-nots, one thing that he's completely and utterly ignoring within that is all three of those categories want more. All three of them, because that's humanity.
Yeah. It's to want something is basically to be human.
I was going to actually make that same point because the want mores could be removed from have a littles completely. And it could just be the have nots, have a littles, and the haves, because each single group there, arguably not the haves, but if we look at what the haves do with their lives, we know they are always working for more, because why would they stop? But, and it kind of makes you wonder what is the outcome of conceptualizing the world in that way. Is it going to be unity when everybody is the have a little want more? That doesn't sound right.
I think this is a very clever way of him to hammer in this class dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
He makes it seem like the have-nots are noble in a sense because they're content where they are, or they're not greedy.
Excellent
But
point.
to have a little and want more, no, those people want more. Like, what's wrong with them?
Yep.
And the haves, well,
Yep.
you assume they're satisfied with you assume they're satisfied for X or Y reason when they could also be want mores. I think what Stanton pointed out, that everybody wants more, is very accurate.
Mm-hmm.
It's and so for our two new readers, basically he separates three classes. It's basically the have-nots, which is basically lower class, the haves, which is higher upper class, and then the have a little want mores, which is basically middle class.
It sounds like to me as if, how do I describe this? It doesn't matter the politics of the person. It just matters the material conditions, and then they justify it after the fact.
It's definitely off a material condition standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Very materialist.
And this chapter very much highlights how, like, the whole power pattern thing, right? And so India has their government, and then what they do when they're in government is they actually outlaw passive resistance.
Even though the very nature of their independence movement was passive resistance.
Well, the thing is that because it worked, so it's like, well, what happens if some opposing force also uses this on our new government that we've just established?
They lose political power.
Well, I mean, unless you outlaw it.
Yeah, unless you outlaw it.
That's one of the things that I'm finding pretty funny about, I guess, overall, I don't even know what to call it, a perception of, American nationalism at this point. Like, there's so many things that are ignored, and one of those is like, hey, you can burn the flag. Like, you have the right to protest. You have the right to be in opposition to the system if the system puts you down.
Well, you can do it. You can do it whether the system puts you down, up, in the middle, sideways. You can do it anyway. It doesn't matter who you are or where you're at.
Well, what I'm trying to bring up is seems very, very odd to me that within this climate right now, there's so many people that are acting as if that doesn't exist, and yet they're utilizing it. And she's like, "Oh, it's the worst fucking country on the earth." No, it's really not. Like, are you just surprised by how wet the water is, or are you unaware of the water that you're swimming through, you fish?
Well, that kind of leads into my next point here. The last paragraph that was read, all great leaders invoked moral principles to cover for naked self-interest. And he makes the examples of freedom, equality, and a law higher than man.
Isn't he kind of doing that himself with this entire book?
I mean, maybe, but the thing about this is, if you consider freedom, equality, and a higher law, which is a representation for some moralism, what you're trying to say, things that are outside of self-interest are easily used to cover for your own self-interest, which kind of dirties the whole idea of freedom, equality, and moral goodness, which is insane, which doesn't make any sense at all.
It's completely discounting the idea that people want to be moral.
The are you talking about like how self-interest is like you're saying that self-interest is like antithetical to freedom and equality of mankind and all that stuff?
No, it is, but on a personal level, when he's talking about all leaders use these moral principles to cover for their own self-interest, I mean, isn't self-interest what everybody's after here? Like in that context?
Well, from a Randian perspective, self-interest is moral, so, you know.
I mean, you wouldn't be a revolutionary if you didn't have some self-interest in it.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is interesting in that the Indians, once they got their independence, outlawed passive resistance. But when the British were in power, they didn't. They didn't take that sort of Machiavellian step. Is it sort of another part of their Machiavellian ways, or is it moral?
Well, you know how what they say of the revolution, like the revolutionaries are the first ones to be put against the wall. Like you can't have the agitators still running around.
Yeah.
Well, this I don't know. I consider this book very much a political science book rather than anything that is because I don't think the book is trying to be moral. I think this book is trying to lay down like hard truths as much as possible and giving examples of why that is the case. So when he's saying that naked self-interest in the clothing of freedom, equality of mankind, a law higher than man-made law, and so on and so forth, he's saying that this is like the truth of reality, where if you are a person who is going for power, so to speak, or let's say it's the opposite way around. Let's say you actually are fighting for freedom or equality of mankind or a law higher than man-made law. So you have some ideal in mind, but that ideal is technically in some sense a self-interest. And because that's your ideal, you will go to whatever method is necessary, therefore making it moral because it appeals to that ideal.
It's almost completely ignoring self-sacrifice, though. Like, self-sacrifice does exist. People will...
It could be that you could self-sacrifice, but it's like it may not get you anything.
Yeah.
I think Garth might be right about that, because the previous paragraph, he's talking about how Machiavelli was blind to the necessity for that moral cover, and that became his major weakness. It's essentially just saying right there at the end, the last sentence, all effective actions require the passport of morality. That means you have to have that book to get stamped to actually be effective with your revolutionary action, whatever that may be. So as long as you have a relatable rationalization, your actions will be viewed upon in a more positive light, and you can get away with more things skirting on the edge of immoral.
Well, it reminds me of calling a movement one thing and then it's actually not that thing.
Yeah, it's like if you have a president running for re-election and you called him a Nazi for 4 years, and after that 4 years, you feel like the next election is so important that you can rationalize cheating in the election to get him out.
Exactly.
Yeah, all right, man. Okay, I see where you're going with this now.
Necessary.
So
what are you talking about? I don't recall anything like that ever happening.
It's never happened, ever.
So this is in the previous chapter called The Purpose. He says, "For it was wrong to assume that man would pursue morality on a level higher than his day-to-day living demanded. It was a disservice to the future to separate morality from man's daily desires and elevate it to a plane of altruism and self-sacrifice. The fact is that it is not man's better nature but his self-interest that demands that he be his brother's keeper. We now live in a world where no man can have a loaf of bread while his neighbor has none. If he does not share his bread, he dare not sleep, for his neighbor will kill him. To eat and sleep in safety, man must do the right thing, for seemingly the wrong reasons, and be in practice his brother's keeper. So this is where he's saying how part of a lot of this is going to be that people will not pursue their morality that is higher than their needs, so to speak. So that and this is why this is very political in the sense, because politics is addressing how people act and what their needs are, is that we won't pursue anything higher than what our needs actually are.
That sounds like bullshit to me.
Well, it might sound like bullshit, but is it true?
I can see it being mostly true, but it's almost ignoring another element of reality, which is some people not just out for self-interest, but they're tapping into their own moral intuitions, especially with fairness and things along those lines. Well, then again, you could probably argue, oh, well, they're satisfying their moral intuition of fairness. Of course, yes, you can. But
and they're doing it to be socially healthy. So they're satisfying a social need. So that's to try and steelman Saul Alinsky, that's what he might say.
Yeah, it's something seems fishy to me.
It just seems to me like a typical power corruption strategy that is pervasive in almost every bloody system of people who get power. They go blood drunk with it when they've never had it. And yeah, it's obviously the revolutionaries will be the one on the chopping block first because they have nothing to lose. When they get in power, they're going to demand things. And if they don't want to deal with the people who are crazy, yeah, they'll kill them first. That's just common sense. It's not exactly morally justified, but, if they would say, hey, look, we're in power now, fuck everyone else. Absolute power corrupts, absolutely. Actually, I think even in this book he said it's some power corrupts, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's an accurate take.
Yep.
Even some power can, drive you crazy or whatever.
I actually don't think it's some power. I think it's people who've never had it. It's like the same people with money who've never had money. They don't know what to do with it. They go, hey,
that is a very valid analogy, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's the main thing I was thinking about when I was reading that. It's just that, this is just basic power structure of people who have something. And I don't like the distinction of power. This is not like a libertarian thing of yes, power can corrupt, but it's also the case of excessive power in the hands of wrong people can do a lot of harm. It can also do a lot of good, but you need the checks and balances, because if you don't, the wrong people, when they get it, will again go absolute blood drunk with it and then cause absolute hell.
Well, okay. So, because I don't know, I've been thinking a lot about this book, because in the sense that, well, then who exactly are the wrong people? And then are they wrong because they aren't in power, or are they wrong because the people in power are merely saying that they're wrong?
They're wrong because their ideas will kill people.
Thank you. They are wrong because they're also antithetical to what they're preaching as well. They're like, oh, yeah, diversity is our strength. Diversity is our strength. Meanwhile, silence everybody else who doesn't agree with me.
They're hypocrites.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm not trying to equate this to people who are to equivalent to people today. I'm saying that as a general...
overall. Gotcha.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, because their current platform requires state overreach that is against the Constitution. That will be their argument.
Well, yes, and then the other side also has an argument for the Republicans.
Yeah, but their arguments are shit.
Well, that's the thing. That's just a power play right there. If you just say that their arguments are shit.
Well, I feel like if you have this doctrine that is the foundation that has kept the peace in your country since its inception post-revolution, and you want to challenge it, you're tearing apart at the fabrics of your society. So they have a good case of, we have laws and structures in place, and you're trying to tear at them, and this is going to cause problems. So I imagine that would be their justification for, I don't want to say the pressure force, but an increasingly heavy hand and kind of kicking their ass.
Well, but then at the same time, because a lot of what this book is that it's questioning that status quo. So it's like, has it always been that way in the past? I mean, that's why nowadays people are like questioning like the whole history of America and everything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So then you need to answer that question.
That's
if you're in the realm of power playing.
That's the positive side of critical theory. Like it actually does have that utility to it. It wouldn't exist if it didn't have a positive utility, even morally.
I would be less skeptical of their motives if they didn't do the power play of the communists. That is what frightens me. It's just like, hey, look, history is repeating itself, so maybe let's not pay attention to these ridiculous idiots that try and smash private property in the name of fairness. That's just idiotic. So that would be it's very much a case of your behavior is reminiscent of previous patterns of history, which ended in complete chaos and murder and famine and death. So yeah, let's not try to run your experiment for the how manyth time and it fail again. There are actual lives at stake.
And that's
So
where
that would be the reason why that.
Exactly.
That's where there's a level of hypocrisy, because it's almost as if, oh, we've seen this happen multiple times. Oh, no, it won't happen this time. No, we are for fairness and equality. We are for
but you're
not
for
having
fairness and
people killed.
equality in our way.
Yeah,
It's very difficult to argue with people when their entire rhetoric is based on their own morality and not facts.
Yeah, and they use bait and switch and Mott and Bailey kind of stuff. It's like, whoa. You're against fairness in this case. No.
Yeah,
Well, you're
what
using a
is
different
fairness?
definition of fairness here.
Yeah.
And then you're also using a different definition of fairness when you're arguing against me. You can't do that. That's not...
The definition of fairness is that guy who provides the ability for them to sit in their underwear at 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning and order something to the entire world is oppressive. That's their mentality.
Exactly.
They are their own oppressor. Interesting.
Also,
They view anyone that has achieved wealth through providing services to their fellow man as oppressive, which is fucking insane.
Exactly.
It's a very bizarre worldview to have, and one that just smacks of ignorance. And frankly, people that have never read anything more than 5 minutes of a Wikipedia article.
I'm definitely picking up from what Garth is putting down. I'm not really looking at this in a high enough resolution.
That's exactly what I'm trying to do. Is I'm trying to get this as a high resolution as possible, not in the now, but this is this book is making a very trying to make a very significant statement in regards to political science. And how true is that statement? And it's taking it on a very social level.
I think that my problem with this is, I'm not looking at it with enough high resolution. What I'm doing is I'm looking at it through the lens of the now. I mean, there obviously is a point in time where there should be revolution, there should be revolt. Morally, for the pragmatic means of it. What I'm so steeped in this culture of a lot of fucking people just acting as if they're fucking oppressed when they're not.
Yeah.
And therefore that justifies the revolution.
The very hard part about it is that oppression is very subjective. Because, just because you don't perceive it as something that's oppressive doesn't mean that person doesn't necessarily do. I also believe that suffering is a phenomenon that is also very, very subjective.
Yeah, and it's suffering is one of the weirdest phenomena too, because you can have somebody who has, like a fucking, they're in a millionaire's mansion, but their partner breaks up with them. They're going to suffer just as much as somebody with, like living in a fucking single shack and their partner breaks up with them. Like it's so weird.
Suffering is basically one of the key things that how we know that we're human. If we didn't suffer on like some level or scale, it's like it would be very hard for us to be able to differentiate like almost anything.
How much of it think it's because they have nothing to suffer about?
I mean, they probably do. I don't think I would.
But their problems are like first world ones. Their problem is a photo took 5 minutes or 5 seconds too long to load on Instagram. That's the epitome of their problems.
Well, they might have problems with I studied for 7 years and I can only get out of college with a minimum wage job. I can survive on minimum wage. Blah blah blah. They are problems that are of their own doing. They chose to go to college for a bad degree. They chose to get into loans. They chose to go through with it. They chose to choose the living they not necessarily choose the living conditions, but they choose to not go into rough work because I don't know, maybe it's above them or whatever. They do. There are some legitimate problems, but they do have a lot of like personal responsibility to them.
But their struggles are not nearly that of our parents, even our grandparents. They went through wars. The threat
Yes.
of
No, yeah. If your argument is that the world is better today than it was then, yeah, like obviously.
yes. And I feel like having a struggle is what builds character in you. Having something to move forward and avoiding death is a hell of a one to build a strong
Absolutely.
sense of. Whereas now we don't have that. We have an overabundance to the point where people are losing their minds because they don't have a goal.
Mandatory service. No, just kidding.
Hedonism you're talking about.
I will say there is something to be said for people who go into the military. There is a sense of purpose and discipline that is very much lacking from a lot of young people. I'm not advocating for military service. I'm just saying I know a lot of people who went into it to come out of it, and they come out, I wouldn't really say conservative, but more minded in that kind of direction. That very driven, disciplined mindset seems to have been drilled into them through military discipline.
It is definitely a very content with the structures at B, and that's usually how conservatives are. Not to say that against them or anything. I don't know. Conservatives, and I say this as someone who lives in a conservative family, that they kind of live in a world of their own, but not in almost a negative way. It's that just everything is structured, and they don't like. Something that they're really good at doing is that they're really good at focusing in on the things that are most relevant to them. Like usually they'll say like family. Like family is like super important to people who are conservative. And obviously we see that everywhere nowadays. A lot of other times it's God, and so that is the thing that structures their life. Like people who are on the other side of the political spectrum, they really do have to like build it from the ground up. They have to tackle a lot more because there's no
structure to them, and that's why conservatives do well. Like what Jordan Peterson said is, he said the difference between the conservative and the liberal is the liberals are good at waving the chaotic storms, and they're good at discovering things that are new, and conservatives are really good at running things once they're set. So that's why you have the one side. The one side is good at figuring out the creativity, and the one side is once the creativity is cemented, they're really good at running it in an orderly fashion.
Yes,
so you need that
perfect
balance.
Yeah,
I feel like a lot of young people nowadays. I also think it's because technology has rapidly developed to the point where there is very little time for things to cement because they're changing so quickly. And I feel like that is a new part of our daily lives that is a bit overwhelming for people who are not used to it, is that things change so rapidly, more so than they have in the past. Like if you look at the amount of technological innovation the last 3 decades versus the last 100 years before it, it's staggering. It is insane.
Absolutely.
Especially with the I don't know, I consider the computer a Gutenberg revolution.
Oh, absolutely.
Dude,
the computer has changed
still don't know how
everything.
important it is. Yeah.
You know what I also think is a massive thing? I think the erosion of patience is a huge factor.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Instant gratification is horrible.
Yes, yeah, we live in a society of instant gratification, and if you look at our grandparents and things, everything they did as far as their lives took multiple generations in time, and they didn't have any instant feedback mechanism inside their brain, whereas our generation has nothing but that. So if you try to instill to them an idea that will take several years, to them it's like, no, fuck, it's not worth it, I want it now.
What I've really been trying to think about as far as like the revolts and shit that are going on, and it's there almost seems to be an element within it that is discontented with this instant gratification society, and it's saying like tear it down.
It's the negatives of consumerism, in my opinion.
I'm not even sure what they're actually upset about.
Yeah, I don't think they realize what they are, what they're actually tearing down.
Yeah.
Oh no, of course they don't.
They're useful idiots.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like They feel like something's wrong, but they don't exactly know what.
Mm-hmm.
I don't
So
even think
they're-
it's they feel. I think it's because they've been told something is wrong.
Well, they feel like something's wrong because they live in a life that is meaning is hard to come by. So their meaning comes in these little single serving packet sizes, and it leaves them wanting it. They're looking for substance.
Yeah, I actually really do agree with that. Is that people nowadays have a problem with trying to find meaning in their lives. It's like, even though we have this technologically advanced society that is able to do a lot, is that we still have people who are committing suicide. So why is that?
I'm reminded very much of, say, the example where people who are illiterate tend to have exponentially better memories than people who are literate.
They can't write stuff down.
Yeah, like there's a necessity there. Like meaning is not being satisfied, and therefore people are kind of, rather than going for the traditional means, are going for new ones, but they're so ridiculously literate within the, like, very, very high information world that memory's gone. If that makes any sense.
It does make sense, I think.
Yeah, I definitely see what you're saying, because why do I need to memorize it when I can just have it somewhere on my computer and immediately look it up? I don't have to memorize when the Civil War happened, because I can always just look up on the computer when the Civil War happened.
Should we move on?
If anyone doesn't have any other thoughts, then yes, we'll move on.
Let's move on.
Move on.
The examples are everywhere. In the United States, the rise of the civil rights movement in the late 1950s was marked by the use of passive resistance in the South against segregation. Violence in the South would have been suicidal. Political pressure was then impossible. The only recourse was economic pressure with a few fringe activities. Legally blocked by state laws, hostile police, and courts, they were compelled, like all have-nots, from time immemorial to appeal to a law higher than man-made law. In his Social Contract, Rousseau noted the obvious that law is a very good thing for men with property and a very bad thing for men without property. Passive resistance remained one of the few means available to anti-segregationalist forces until they had secured the voting franchise in fact. Furthermore, passive resistance was also a good defense tactic, since it curtailed the opportunities for use of the power resources of the status quo for forcible repression. Passive resistance was chosen for the same pragmatic reason that all tactics are selected, but it assumes the necessary moral and religious adornment. However, when passive resistance becomes massive and threatening, it gives birth to violence. Northern Negroes have no tradition of Dharma and are close enough to their northern compatriots so that contrasting conditions between the North and the South are visible as well as a constant spur. Add to this the fact that the Southern poor whites do not operate by British tradition but reflect generations of violence. The future does not argue for making a special religion of nonviolence. It will be remembered for what it was, the best tactic for its time and place. As more effective means becomes available, the Negro civil rights movement will divest itself of these decorations and substitute a new moral philosophy in keeping with its new means and opportunities. The explanation will be as it has always been: times have changed. This is happening today.
There's your boy, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, being mentioned.
I will say, on that statement alone, it is technically correct.
You're biased.
Okay, maybe I'm speaking too soon. I need to read Rousseau at some point, because there are parts of Rousseau that I actually highly agree with. And his Social Contract was very influential when making the U.S. Constitution.
I really do not like the statement, law is a very good thing for men with property and a very bad thing for men without property. I don't think that's a fair assessment. I really don't. It's overgeneralizing.
It barely scratches the surface of lawmaking, basically. Like,
Yeah.
I just don't think it's a true statement. I mean, we can get deeper into that if you guys want, but
Yeah, no, I understand where you're going. But
There's
they're-
so many laws that protect the little guy from the big guys.
that's one of my favorite things about America.
I do want to think about that quote a little bit, because the thing about Rousseau is that he wrote a piece of work called The Origin of Inequality. And so in his mind, that the reason that we have this sense of inequality is because of property, and that we were able to acquire property, and that in a sense was kind of the origins of inequality. So I think on an ideal level, that statement is true.
I think that property should tie entirely into the idea of fairness. It's an exchange for something. You have put in this much effort, and therefore you get this
As a reward for your actions.
Property is the fruit of your labor. Like, property is yours because you either built
Capital
it
is
or...
the fruit of your labor.
Exactly. Capital can translate into property, it can translate into goods. That is property against services.
And if it wasn't that way, why would people be complaining about minimum wages?
Because it's an inflation tax, that's why.
It is an inflation tax.
Well,
Can you explain that? I don't know what that means.
Because if it will devalue money, and the people who have savings, for example, their money will be worth less over a certain period of time if you keep ramping up the minimum wage.
Mm-hmm.
That's why.
it honestly
I see what you mean.
it only works though on a large scale though, like, because a lot of these like larger city areas in the US are starting to do the higher minimum wage taxes. However, if you go outside of those cities, then that's not the case. So it really only works on a larger scale. People are just going to move out of the cities who can afford to.
Exactly.
That's the whole problem when it comes to the whole taxing the rich, because if you tax them too much, and it's like, well, we're going to leave, and we have the means to leave, so we're going to do it.
The funny thing about taxing the rich is that it actually results in less state revenue.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
But try telling that to a lefty.
Can you explain that to the viewer and me?
Oh Lord.
Okay, no, it's really simple.
With Milton Friedman.
Yeah, a little bit.
Are you talking about capital exodus, like exodus of capital?
Not just that. It's a very simple thing of, there's been 4 times in the last century that this has been done. It was done under the Woodrow Wilson administration, Reagan, Kennedy, and Bush, which is, if you strip away the amount of tax people pay, more people will pay the tax. So, for example, people who earned over 100K in the Woodrow Wilson administration, they were paying something like 30% of the annual federal income budget. When they stripped the tax from 60% down to 40% or 24%, I think the budget went over $1 billion, and the people over 100K, they were now paying over like 76%. Because what would happen is, if the tax rate is too high, people simply don't pay it. So they hide their money in kind of offshore or bonds where the tax people can't reach it. So what would happen is, if they lower the tax rate, what would happen is there's now more taxable income.
Yeah, it's like the tax is so low that it's like, yeah. Okay, I'll pay it.
Here's a simple way. If I was selling something for $10 and I sold 5 units versus I lowered it to $7.50 and I sold 20.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, okay, I see.
Yeah. But the reason people, the lefties don't really go for that is because that actually requires facts and reasoning. Whereas if you just say, I tax the rich, well, that sounds good for their political statement. So it's a problem with perception versus reality.
Yeah, exactly. They don't know that there's like people can like offshore or whatever.
Yeah.
Or flee from the places who would charge them more.
Yeah. And I think if you ask them, like, the mega rich, how much of the annual state budget do they actually pay? They'll go, holy shit, they pay so much. What happens when they leave? You fill the gap, motherfucker. Or tried to. And this is why high taxes are shit. I don't understand. I don't understand how anyone can think, if I give more money into the hands of politicians, they will do the right thing. Are you insane?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I'm right there with you.
It's bizarre.
I've been wondering about that a lot as well. Like, it's almost with people who lack their own self-awareness and accountability, they just want somebody else to take care of it for them. That's probably one of the problems with so much damn convenience in the world. people can't be self-sufficient anymore. They can't even be morally self-sufficient at this point. So they're just like, somebody else do it for me.
So here's what I'm thinking with that Jean-Jacques Rousseau quote, is that law is a very good thing for men with property and very bad for men without property, because you could profit off property. If you don't have any property or don't know how to gain property, then obviously it's going to be terrible for you. Now, possibly, again, this is my thing, because if I'm trying to steel man Alinsky as best as possible, is that he is talking about the people and the have-nots just because they are have-nots, but because they don't know how to.
They don't have the knowledge to how to increase their capital.
Not even necessary knowledge, but just, well, possibly knowledge, but also like a functioning.
Okay, yeah. Because
think about it, like, how well is a psychopath actually able to, or maybe not a psychopath. Psychopath. Like, how well, there is an extent to which a psychopath can function well in a society, because he needs to learn how to do things that are going to be the most beneficial to other people. He has to know, he has to get other people's interest in mind, because he knows that he has his own interests. It requires a certain level of self-awareness, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about the second to last and last paragraph. He says, the future does not argue for making a special religion out of nonviolence. It will be remembered, it being nonviolence, for what it was, the best tactic for its time and place. Continues to say, as more effective means become available, the Black Civil Rights Movement will divest itself from these decorations and substitute a new moral philosophy in keeping with its new means and opportunities. The explanation will be, as it's always been, times have changed. This is happening today.
It's the current year.
Yeah, I certainly can agree that passive measures are maximally efficient in the long run. Why is he ignoring that? It's almost as if, it's the only one that'll work for my means.
I believe so. And honestly, if I was looking at what was accomplished with the civil rights movement and nonviolence compared to what's trying to be accomplished right now and explicit violence, there is a huge imbalance of means and ends going on. If anything, the current riots and things going on would be much more morally justified if it was back when the civil rights movement was actually going on. I feel like they would have been more justified. But now we're talking about a relatively minor issues with the police and having that bleed out into practically a war on the streets with violence and terrorism happening constantly. It makes me think of the ideas that are thrown around and people say there are no bad tactics, just bad people, and other revolutionary mottos that get people to rationalize things in the heat of the moment.
I agree with that last one.
He's being completely ignorant of the idea of progressivism. Completely ignorant.
I don't know if that's true.
Oh, it's just what works now? Rather than, hey, society has actually progressed and we're trying to do things better?
Well, here's the thing, is that I think a lot of this is actually painted in a progressive lens because, well, number one, he does accurately label himself as a progressive. And then secondly, is that, again, in a sense, this is pragmatic. And if you fundamentally believe that things are always going to be constantly changing all the time, then the view that you want is something that is going to be pragmatic, because if it works, no matter what it changes into. Yeah. So what you want to do is you want to find that formula for what is pragmatic.
Well, do you know why cognitive behavioral therapy exists? It's for people that have already adjusted their lives to the way that things are, and it's also not progressive for them as an individual. Somebody who has an abusive parent, let's say, is constantly they're going to be terrified, but they're also going to adjust their behavior in a way and think of themselves in a certain way that helps them survive that situation.
That definitely may be true, but I guess I'm more so responding to the notion that this is not being painted in a progressive lens, which I just think it is, for the reasons that I stated.
Which definition of progressive? Like actual progress or
Or the
buzzword?
regressive, so-called regressive, yeah.
Well, I mean, I have to go by Saul Alinsky's definition of his view of the myth of Sisyphus analogy and how he paints that. That's his view of progressivism.
I did want to finish the whole thing about cognitive behavioral therapy. It exists in order to unburrow a person from a survival tactic, from stressful circumstances, or a way to survive, or just, general bad ways of thinking about the world.
Well, I think this is a good time to continue reading.
Yep. The 11th rule of the ethics of means and ends is that goals must be phrased in general terms like liberty, equality, fraternity, of the common welfare, pursuit of happiness, or bread and peace. Whitman put it, the goal once named cannot be countermanded. It has been previously noted that the wise man of action knows that frequently in the stream of action of means towards ends, whole new and unexpected ends are among the major results of the action. From a civil war fought as a means to preserve the Union came the end of slavery. In this connection, it must be remembered that history is made up of actions in which one end results in other ends. Repeatedly, scientific discoveries have resulted from experimental research committed to ends or objectives that have little relationship with the discoveries. Work on a seemingly minor practical program has resulted in feedbacks of major creative basic ideas. J.C. Flugel notes in Man, Morals, and Society that, in psychology too, we have no right to be astonished if, while dealing with a means, e.g., the culture of a neurotic symptom, the discovery of more efficient ways of learning, or the relief of industrial fatigue, we find that we have modified our attitude toward the end, acquiring some new insight into the nature of mental health, the role of education, or the place of work in human life. The mental shadow boxing on the subject of means and ends is typical of those who are the observers and not the actors in the battlefields of life. In The Yogi and the Commissar, Kostler begins with the basic fallacy of an arbitrary demarcation between expediency and morality, between the yogi, for whom the end never justifies the means, and the Commissar, for whom the end always justifies the means. Kostler attempts to extricate himself from this self-constructed straitjacket by proposing that the end justify the means only within narrow limits. Here Kostler, even in an academic confrontation with action, was compelled to take the first step in the course of compromise on the road to action and power. How narrow the limits, and who defines the narrow limits, opens the door to the premises discussed here. The kind of personal safety and security sought by the advocates of the sanctity of means and ends lies only in the womb of yogism or the monastery. And even there it is darkened by the repudiation of that moral principle that they are their brother's keepers.
I think that Saul stopped short with his introductory of that bit there. Like, these movements must be called this way. How about they actually are that way? Like, it is for, what is it? Must be phrased in general terms, like liberty, equality, fraternity, of the common welfare. He's stopping a step short there. It's not that they need to be phrased that way. They should actually be that way. You can't just call it that. Like, this is the biggest problem that I have with bait and switch tactics that are happening right now.
Pragmatism.
It's not saying that.
He's trying to be pragmatic. That's what you gotta drill that in your head. Like, he doesn't care about actually doing all of this stuff.
Well, it's not saying that he doesn't care about that. While what we're seeing right now makes us think like it's a cloak to cover for some other type of power play, what this actually is, a lot of things can be boiled down and placed into these terms. Liberty, equality, fraternity. That's a very broad 3 things. Add the common welfare. I mean, that can be anything. Pursuit of happiness. I mean, come on. That's the pursuit of happiness. That's everybody's life. Bread and peace. That's food and peace. That's another common goal. So really what he's saying is, in order to be successful, you need to frame your goal in something that everyone can agree with.
I just have Paul stuck in my head. Faith without works is dead. I guess I'm starting to see where you're coming from. It's just I've got that so stuck in my head. I can't separate myself from it, and maybe that's a personal fault of my own.
I don't know if it's a fault, but it would definitely make it harder to understand this book. Because
Absolutely.
Again, a lot of this book, it's like, if you have a faith that something is like, this book would be like, I don't know if undermine is the right word, but I almost want to say undermine, because of the harsh truths that it's trying to put forward. Like, basically what Stanton just, what I would say, accurately described. He's saying, like, it's like, okay, that may be true, however, it doesn't, like, work.
Yeah, it's that reminds me of the whole, crucified hero archetype. Like, the person that's actually doing the best work is substituted for a criminal kind of thing. Right.
If you combine the thing that I was talking about earlier with this, that's when it really starts to feel a little bit sticky. We were talking about all effective actions requiring the passport of morality and clothing the self-interest in freedom, equality, and law. If you add this to it, it really comes across as these are the things that you need to use to cover your intentions, to cover your self-interest. You're covering your self-interest in the interest of the group, which it really leaves a bad taste in your mouth, because it is explicitly saying how easy it is to hide self-interest in these types of general terms.
Oh.
And that is something that is pretty sketchy. I mean, these are the tools that you need to exploit self-interest and exploit your own self-interest on the populace. And a lot of times this could be totally required. It's totally something that is completely sane, and these are the things that need to be done. But for a lot of the stuff, it's just kind of like, man, these are some powerful tools, and if you use them wrong, it's really, really going to bite you in the ass.
I'm having some difficulty here, because it's like you can call a movement bread and peace, but if you're doing it that way and then you subvert it, or you're just using that as a label to cover your own ass, that's not actually morally good. Yes, that is just getting to the means of an end, but that's also ignoring the means. It's setting a bad fucking precedent.
Yeah.
And that precedent sets up people to doubt history. It's like, wait. They said that it was this, peace and happiness thing, but they actually killed hundreds of millions of people in the course of doing that. That doesn't sound like peace and happiness to me. Like that's where I have the problems with this guy with the freaking ends and means stuff.
And I totally get that. Because this is the question that is before us, really, with all this information, is how do you tell what is a justifiable means? And how do you tell when you are righteous in using these powers? There is no really there is no definition for that, because it's so subjective. It's something that really comes down to what you can get away with, essentially.
Does this particular ends justify this particular means?
Yeah. And it's It's like what you can get away with, because that's essentially all this really boils down to. It's kind of what is the things available to you? What's the spectrum of that, from violent to non-violent, and everything in between?
No, it's
Where is your means, and where does that line get drawn? And looking at all this, it's really it's up to you. And that's really scary, because when you have radicals that might not be the most educated or the most understanding of history and how things work out, or maybe they completely do understand it and they just have their own perspective in it, taking control. And that's probably a fear that everybody has, be it the radicals on any side of a political paradigm taking over and destroying the society that you currently live in.
okay. I'm also stumbling over another thing. It almost seemed like this is being treated as if it's an analysis, even though it's an instruction manual. I don't think that's a proper thing to do. It's like, this is how you get what you want. Oh, it's just an analysis. No. It's not an analysis. It's an instruction manual.
I
wouldn't consider it an instruction manual.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to disagree with there too. I don't think it is.
This
Yes.
book is definitely an instruction manual.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time seeing how it isn't an instruction manual.
But here's the thing. At the beginning of the book, he says you have to accept the world as it is.
Yeah, but that's not okay. Yeah, you can recognize that you have to accept that as it is, but okay. Let me stew on that.
It is a training manual. It's just that this is the training manual, and this is the situation you need to use it in.
Well, that's why I say that this book is more like a political science book. It absolutely could be interpreted as an instruction manual, no doubt. However, as far as how I've been reading this book so far and what the author has been saying, I am taking it more of not normative, descriptive claims.
I'll need to stew on that.
So the way I have been conceptualizing it, he's building a formula here, and your variables get plugged into the formula, and it spits out an answer. And that answer is this morally justified? And is this, maybe not so morally justified, but is this pragmatic? Are you actually going to reach your goals through the means that you have? And is it possible? So that's kind of where it's developing. Is you see the rules, you see the formula. You have to put in all of your variables, all of your concerns, and kind of spin the wheel and see what the best route for you is going to be. Because he's brought up multiple different ways, and he really hasn't nailed down anything. Everything's on the table here. That's the part that is the variable, because people can interpret whether a violent revolution would be called for or not. And that's why it's not an instruction manual, because the instruction manual would tell them specifically if it was or was not. That's the instruction. This is more the rules for engagement.
I like that approach.
I'll certainly need to keep my mind a little bit more open.
Oh, well, let's continue.
Yep, last section. Bertrand Russell, in his Human Society in Ethics and Politics, observed that morality is so much concerned with means that it seems almost immoral to consider anything solely in relation to its intrinsic worth. But obviously, nothing has any value as a means unless that to which it is a means has value on its own account. It follows that intrinsic value is logically prior to value as means. The organizer, the revolutionist, The activist, or call him what you will, who is committed to a free and open society, is in that commitment anchored to a complex of high values. These values include the basic morals of all organized religions. Their base is the preciousness of human life. These values include freedom, equality, justice, peace, the right to dissent, the values that were banners of hope and yearning of all revolutions of men, whether the French Revolution's liberty, fraternity, equality, the Russians' bread and peace, the brave Spanish people's better to die on your feet than to live on your knees, or our revolution's no taxation without representation. They include the values in their own Bill of Rights. If a state voted for school segregation or a community organization voted to keep blacks out and claimed justification by virtue of the democratic process, then this violation of the value of equality would have converted democracy into a prostitute. Democracy is not an end. It is the best political means available towards the achievement of these values. Means and ends are so qualitatively interrelated that the true question has never been the proverbial one, does the end justify the means, but has always been, does this particular end justify this particular means?
I still hate the way that he puts it. Particular end, particular mean.
Yeah, it's really amoral.
I think it's basically a reframing of an ethical question. Because does the end justify the means? Like, it's a question. And so he's saying, no. The right question to ask is, does this particular end justify this particular means?
That is a fair nuanced take on that question, or on the old saying, does the end justify the means? Because I guess there are some situations where you could definitely justify some fuckery. But, again, pragmatism.
Yeah, like, lying is morally wrong, but, like, Schindler... Wait, was it Schindler?
Exactly. You would always lie to the Nazi asking if you had...
Oscar Schindler.
Thank you.
What's your take on this, Sass?
It can be easily be perceived as a sort of manual, but I think it's... I didn't read the prior chapters, unfortunately, because, I came in a bit later. But it looks like it's just using a description rather than any sort of prescription of what you should do. More of a description.
Yeah, it definitely does come off as more of a, listen, here's what you need to do type of thing, rather than a, here's how you change minds or whatever. I mean, I guess there might be a whole chapter on that, but it's very practical. It's a very practical book. It's all about, how to get your ideas into power, basically. And honestly, I like the prologue. I like the prologue a lot.
I did.
It seemed to be more idealistic than the actual book.
Mm-hmm.
And it gave me false hope. It gave me false hope, I guess. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
For the book, but yeah,
gave me false hope too.
I am trying to analyze that Bertrand Russell quote, so feel free to keep talking.
I found it interesting that he frames democracy not as an end, but the best political means available towards the achievement of the values of democracy.
I think that is completely fair because,
yeah.
What was the last part?
So democracy is not an end, but is the best political means available towards the achievement of these values.
Well, where is that? Sorry, I'm kind of lost right now.
It's right at the end, second to last paragraph. It's kind of interesting because when you are looking in a current paradigm where minorities have a special kind of power that is not democratic at all. That's
mob.
Yeah, that's minority power, and minority power is not a democratic means. So there has been a change since this book was written, because it used to be democracy was the best means. As long as you can influence enough people, you can get the votes. Where now we're kind of reaching the end of what democracy itself can do. So the framing of putting it into equality and liberty and all of that is trying to bring these minority values up to the level of democratic. But I feel that its power is fading, and there's going to be other means that come in to take its place.
I don't know what you mean by powers fading.
The power of leaning on the democracy to get the changes that a minority group wants, because democracy is the majority.
Yes.
And if you're a minority and you have minority views, you have to trick the majority. I say trick, but I'm using it loosely.
Or convince.
Into supporting the ideas from the minority, being they are in equality and fairness. So it's using the fairness bias to bring forth what could be, in all honesty, it could be for fairness, but it's really easy to use that in a different way. And if that democracy fails, then what's left is not a pretty situation.
I see what you mean.
That gives me a thought along the lines of, like, electoral college exists so that the minority does have a voice. The minority within the majority. I don't know exactly how far that goes down, but it almost seems like we don't even have it in. Yes, we do have it in law, in a sense, but we have like this socially, the social standard that says, yeah, you got to pay attention to the underdog. The first shall be last, the last shall be first. Like, it's ingrained in us. So to just constantly expect that people are ignoring the minority intentionally is really fucking fucked up.
I think Gartham was going to say something as well.
I am trying to analyze that Bertrand Russell quote, but it is... Bertrand Russell was a logician, I believe. So he's a smart guy.
Yeah, I really like one of his quotes. I can't remember which one it is, though.
I don't know. This quote is definitely telling me that Bertrand Russell is a utilitarian socialist, because I believe Bertrand Russell was a socialist at one point. Although I think in his later years, he considered it the other because of the communist experiment in Russia.
He was known for being anti-war during the lead up to the Second World War. He's the one who said Britain needs to disarm while Germany was rearming. So, probably not the wisest man for certain things. I'll take him with a grain of salt.
Yeah. The last part, it follows that intrinsic value is logically prior to value as means.
So this is saying that it's morality and means are so interconnected that if you view something just in worth, just in its physical value, it almost becomes immoral. And this is kind of like the argument that people have against capitalism. Is they're arguing, when people defend capitalism, they say, oh, you're arguing just on the basis of intrinsic worth and not the morality. And then he goes on to say, but obviously nothing has any value as means unless to which it is a means has value on its own account. So that's saying without the value, without that worth, the means and the morality fall apart. So how can you justify, say, a revolution based on class inequality without the intrinsic worth of the society that you are living in and the intrinsic worth of the human being?
I think that was really good. I always get caught up on I may have to read that in larger context, because worth is something that is a very muddled word for me in philosophy. To think about what something is actually worth. And obviously there are people in philosophy that have asked that question. I guess I just don't know enough. But I think the only thing that I got hung up on is the intrinsic worth and how you define that.
Well, the intrinsic worth is anything that has worth, and that could be a spiritual worth, that could be a physical worth, and that could be a moral worth.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So okay, I think I see what you mean. Is that if something has now this is coming together, that if something has worth, so to speak, that therefore it is that it should be pursued morally.
I would say so. As in the last sentence in his quote, is it follows intrinsic value is logically prior to value as means.
Yes. Yeah.
So the intrinsic, it comes before the means value. So you have the intrinsic value that your base is built upon, and from there you look into what is justifiable, what is a value that comes out of your means.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. I think I was overthinking that section, but it's saying that yes, there you start with something that of what you want, and then upon that you then develop your means or your morals afterwards. Yeah. Okay. Yep. That's definitely in philosophy.
Russell just says it in a very moralist way. So
it's very logical.
Yes, it's really, really raw and kind of hard to interpret. But I hope I did a pretty good job.
No, actually, that helped clarify a lot, because the thing about logic is that logic definitely falls apart if you don't have the language to go with it. Like if you can't, like language and logic are so closely related, because the language defines your variables, and then logic is then how you organize those variables.
That's very good. I think that's a very good take.
When it says morality is so much concerned with means, does that just means the means to attain anything?
Yeah, because
yes,
morality, the means is the method, right? So if you use morally repugnant methods, then obviously that's you're concerned with. They'll never act because the means would be too extreme or too abhorrent for them.
Yeah, it would be like if you were to choose to just buy it from the store rather than stealing it from the store.
That doesn't make any sense to me either, because it says someone says with the means that it's almost immoral to consider anything solely in relation to its intrinsic worth. So it's immoral to consider anything solely for its value of a good life. How does that make sense? Like it's moral to consider just the means. Why? Like that makes it sound like you can't have, like it makes it sound like any action is like a gray area.
No, because
I'm kind of catching what he's throwing.
I am, but the end.
It sounds like a weird way of saying the ends doesn't justify the means.
That
in
is
an overly complicated way.
No, he's
like
deconstructing
excessively.
that. He's deconstructing that to explain what that means, basically.
So maybe this could also help with something. Whenever in the field of rationality, something that you have to do when you apply rationality is that you have to have a normative standard. And people will often do this a lot when we develop our morals, right? We will take something as a moral normative standard, so almost like a categorical imperative, and then from there you'll rationally deduce then what your morals are from there. So he's saying that something that has intrinsic value in it, by definition, is something that is immediate. Like it is something that you want if it is intrinsic value in it to you. So therefore, intrinsic value is therefore before your means to get that thing, because you have to have that intrinsic value before you decide you choose your moral methods to achieve it, to achieve that thing you want.
This is out of my intellectual pay grade.
All right,
or it's too late in the evening. Could be one of those two.
Fair enough. It is for me too. I couldn't do it without Stanton. So,
if I were to read what intrinsic value says, it says intrinsic value has traditionally been thought to lie at the heart of ethics. The intrinsic value of something is said to be the value that has a value that thing has in and of itself, for its own sake, or as such, or in its own right.
That's a very modern way of looking at it. I would have considered more of a traditionalist look at intrinsic value, as if it, not of its own right, but objectively outside of its own right.
But take now in its own right and substitute it for intrinsic worth, and you read almost immoral to consider anything solely in relation to its own right. Then that just sounds bizarre. That's what I'm saying. Like it looks like he's trying to muddy the waters by making it excessively linguistically challenging.
It's esoteric.
And one thing that he does say is it's almost immoral to consider anything solely in relation to its intrinsic worth, and that could be true because it's almost immoral to consider any action just based off of the value that it holds to you personally.
That seems to me so. This is almost immoral to consider anything solely in relation to its own value.
To the value that you place onto it.
I don't consider that immoral at all.
Well, that's where it becomes the almost immoral, because
I don't consider it almost immoral. I don't consider it at all.
Well, what could you justify if you only considered the intrinsic worth to your own self?
But that also assumes that my own morality is bad.
No, it's saying that the means that you might want to use to get that value may
be morally suspect. Yes.
Yeah, so you need to judge first the worthiness to you to make a coherent moral decision.
That's what I'm saying. This sounds like the means to an ends kind of thing.
It is.
That's the name of the chapter.
Oh, means to an ends with added bits.
With added bits.
I think Saul probably built this whole chapter off of that one paragraph from Bertrand Russell.
I was going to say, bear in mind, this is not his quote. This is Bertrand Russell's quote.
That one paragraph seems like it would take an entire chapter to explain, so it makes sense.
Yep. Well,
yeah.
We're at the end. Well, we're actually almost a bit over a quarter of the way through, so yay.
Wait, what?
Yeah, we're 59 pages out of 196.
Nice.
Considering there's probably like some filler in there, so keep that in mind.
Well, thank you for joining us today in Flipping Through.
Thank you for having us, and thank you for joining us, Sass and Spoon.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you have any social media or anything you want to plug?
I would if I wasn't banned from all of them. I do have a lesson for all of you. Do not say on the internet. You seem to get banned.
Oh, come on.
There it is.